I'll verify the historical record, and then begin the first continuous portion, keeping the narration citation-free and ready for voiceover. Under the small amber lamp, the ZARELLI case file lies open before you, its oldest pages carrying the dry scent of paper kept through 65 Philadelphia winters. Settle in and let your breathing become unhurried. We begin near Susquehanna Road in February of 1957, where bare branches crossed a pale sky and the ground held the lingering cold of the season. The road passed through the Fox Chase section of northeastern Philadelphia, beyond rows of houses and into a quieter patch of fields, brush, and scattered trees. If you place yourself there, you can hear tires moving over rough pavement, then fading toward the city, while damp leaves press softly beneath your shoes. This was where the ZARELLI case first entered the public record, although Joseph's name wouldn't enter it for more than 6 decades. For investigators arriving there, he was simply an unknown child who needed someone to begin asking careful questions. The discovery was made near the 25th of February, when a young man came upon a large cardboard carton among the undergrowth beside the road. The box had once held a bassinet sold by the J.C. Penney Company, and its printed surface was weathered by moisture and outdoor air. You can imagine the cardboard giving slightly beneath a gloved hand, its fibers softened at the edges, while officers moved quietly through the nearby brush. Nothing about the place supplied an immediate name. The young man didn't report what he'd found at once, fearing that questions about his own presence in the area might distract from the discovery. By the following morning, however, he contacted the police, and the official investigation began on the 26th of February. As you read the first reports, you can almost hear a telephone receiver settle into its cradle, followed by pencils moving across paper in an adjoining room. A case that would outlast generations had begun with that ordinary office sound. The officers who reached Susquehanna Road had no missing person report that clearly matched the child before them. There was no labeled coat, no school book, and no letter that might lead them toward a household waiting anxiously for news. What they had instead were objects, measurements, photographs, and the silent geography of a roadside place. You sit with that first difficulty now, because before investigators could determine what had happened, they had to learn who this little person was. That distinction mattered from the beginning, and it would shape every decade of the inquiry. An unidentified person creates 2 investigations at once, one reaching backward toward a life, and another reaching outward toward circumstances. Without a name, detectives couldn't readily visit relatives, examine family routines, or build a dependable timeline from familiar places. They had to begin with material things, and so you turn toward the box. The carton had been made for a white bassinet and was traced to a J.C. Penney store in Upper Darby, west of Philadelphia. Investigators learned that a small shipment of those bassinets had reached the store late in 1956, and the boxes weren't common enough to be entirely anonymous. The retail price was modest, the object domestic, and the image it suggested belonged to an ordinary nursery rather than a wooded roadside. Yet, sales records couldn't reveal which purchaser had carried away this particular carton. Payment practices were different then, and a cash purchase could leave almost nothing behind except a clerk's uncertain memory. There were no electronic transaction logs, store cameras, or searchable databases waiting behind a polished screen. You can picture a detective standing beneath the bright shop lights, speaking softly with employees while bassinets and blankets rested on nearby shelves. Each answer had to be written down, carried back, and placed inside the growing folder. The blanket offered another possible path, though it was a difficult one. It was a faded plaid textile, the kind of household item that might have passed through years of washing, mending, cupboards, and moves. Detectives circulated its description and showed it to people who might recognize the pattern. But fabric made for ordinary homes rarely carried a unique history. As you study its photograph, the worn weave seems to represent the investigation itself, made from many crossing threads without a single clear edge. There were signs that the child's hair had been cut not long before he was found, and small clippings remained with the evidence. Investigators considered whether a barber, caregiver, clinic worker, or neighbor might remember such a haircut. Yet memories don't arrange themselves neatly for official use. A person may recall the faint snip of scissors, the smell of soap, or loose strands on a towel without remembering a date. You find that human uncertainty written throughout the early notes. The medical examination estimated that the child was between 4 and 6 years old, though later identification established that Joseph was 4. He was small, with blue eyes and light brown hair, and investigators believed he had experienced prolonged neglect before his death. We don't need to dwell on the physical findings tonight, because the patient work of the case lies elsewhere, in the effort to return a child's identity. The examination supplied details, but it couldn't supply the missing story. His fingerprints were taken and compared with the records that were available, although children rarely appeared in official fingerprint collections. Dental information was recorded, and investigators noted physical features that a doctor or family member might recognize. You can imagine the slight tackiness of ink on a print card and the cool metal surfaces of the examination room. Each observation became another quiet attempt to transform an unknown child into someone who had once been called by a name. But there was one more task before the wider search could begin, and it required an unusual kind of care from the investigators. They needed an image the public might recognize, and the available photographs didn't resemble the ordinary portraits families kept on mantels. The child was therefore carefully prepared and photographed in a way meant to suggest how he might have appeared during life. Those images would later trouble some viewers, yet the intention behind them was practical and compassionate. Detectives needed a face that could travel beyond the evidence room and reach someone's memory. A police artist also produced a reconstruction, softening the formal stillness of the photographs into a more familiar expression. When you look across the old reproductions, you can sense the limits of 1957 printing, with grey shadows, coarse dots, and details lost in repeated copying. Even so, a recognizable face could accomplish what written measurements could not. It could pause someone beside a shop window and awaken a private recognition. The Philadelphia Inquirer helped print hundreds of thousands of circulars bearing the child's likeness and the available identifying details. Copies went into homes with utility bills, appeared in stores, and passed from hand to hand throughout the region. Imagine opening an envelope at a kitchen table, hearing the rustle of thin paper, and finding the face of an unknown boy beside the month's gas account. The investigation entered domestic life through that quiet, ordinary route. This distribution was immense by the standards of the time, and it reflected how strongly investigators believed someone must know him. Children belonged to networks of neighbors, doctors, grocers, teachers, relatives, and playmates, even when their home circumstances were hidden. Somewhere, detectives reasoned, there should be an empty chair or an unanswered question. You can feel their hope in the scale of the printing, although hope alone couldn't make someone speak. Officers checked reports of missing children from Philadelphia and communities beyond it. They contacted schools, institutions, hospitals, orphanages, and welfare agencies, working through lists that existed only on paper or in separate local offices. There was no national digital system capable of comparing a description against records within seconds. Every inquiry required a call, a letter, a visit, or the slow arrival of an envelope bearing a typed reply. You can almost hear those replies accumulating in the station. Each envelope opened beneath fluorescent light, while winter coats dried on hooks nearby. Some concerned children who had already returned home, while others led toward families whose missing loved ones clearly didn't match. Detectives crossed out names, added dates, and filed the results. Progress often meant learning, patiently, that one more possible road wasn't the correct road. Telephone calls arrived from people who thought they had recognized the face. A child once seen near a market, a family that had moved suddenly, or a neighbor whose household seemed unusually quiet could all become a lead. Officers listened, recorded, and followed up, because the one useful memory might sound no different at first from a mistaken one. You sit beside them in imagination, hearing the desk phones ring through the warm, tobacco-scented air. Many callers meant well, but memory is suggestible, especially when an image becomes familiar through repeated public display. A face seen in a newspaper can blend with a child noticed months earlier on a trolley or pavement. Investigators had to remain courteous while asking exact questions about dates, clothing, addresses, and relationships. Their work required openness and skepticism in equal measure, a balance you can feel in the careful language of each report. The search extended beyond people to the landscape around the discovery site. Officers examined the nearby ground, the roadside, and objects scattered in the area, trying to decide what belonged to the case and what had simply collected outdoors. The smell of wet earth mixed with exhaust from passing vehicles, while boots moved through stiff weeds and discarded packaging. A roadside offers many traces, but few of them announce their meaning. Investigators looked for tire impressions, footprints, labels, and anything else that might connect the carton to a person or vehicle. Yet weather, passing time, and ordinary roadside disturbance had already blurred much of what might once have been distinct. You can picture an officer crouching beside a shallow mark, measuring it, then recognizing that certainty wasn't possible. Good investigation often includes the discipline of writing unknown. That word appears frequently in cold files, and it isn't an admission of indifference. It marks the boundary between what evidence supports and what imagination merely offers. The ZARELLI investigators would encounter countless theories, many of them vivid enough to feel persuasive for a while. Still, a patient detective returns to the page and asks which details can actually bear the weight of a conclusion. As the first weeks passed, the child's image became familiar across Philadelphia. Yet familiarity didn't bring identification. Police stations, post offices, and shop counters displayed the circular, its paper curling slightly as indoor heat met damp winter air. People paused, looked, and carried the memory onward. Somewhere between seeing and knowing, however, the essential connection remained absent. The child was temporarily known through descriptive phrases used by investigators and newspapers. Most often, the boy in the box. Much later, the memorial name, America's Unknown Child, would also become associated with him. These names kept public attention alive, but they weren't the name given at his birth. As you hold the file open, you can feel that difference, because a label describes a mystery, while a real name restores a life. In 1957, detectives didn't know that the missing name was Joseph Augustus ZARELLI. They didn't know that he had been born on the 13th of January, 1953, in Philadelphia, Nor could they know that the answer was present somewhere in civic records, separated from their evidence by privacy rules, incomplete connections, and the absence of searchable technology. The solution to identity existed, but it rested behind closed drawers and unlinked paperwork. That is one of the quieter lessons of the ZARELLI case. Information may exist without being reachable, and two accurate records can remain strangers when no common name connects them. A birth certificate in one office and an unidentified child file in another might sit only miles apart for decades. You can imagine their metal cabinets humming faintly in heated rooms, each holding half of an unanswered question. The early investigators also faced a painful practical problem. Joseph apparently hadn't been reported missing. Without a complaint from a parent, guardian, or institution, there was no direct file waiting to meet the description from Susquehanna Road. Detectives were searching not merely for a child, but for the household or arrangement from which his absence had gone officially unspoken. You return to that blank space often, because it shaped every search. They checked children who were believed to have lived with foster families or in informal care arrangements. Mid-century family life could include private placements, unrecorded agreements, temporary stays with relatives, and changes never communicated clearly to public agencies. A child might leave one home and enter another without generating a reliable administrative trail. For the investigators, each possibility meant another set of doors, interviews, and handwritten addresses. Officers visited houses where a lead suggested something might be learned, sometimes finding worried families, and sometimes only a misunderstanding. You can picture front rooms with polished furniture, radiators clicking, and curtains holding back the grey Philadelphia afternoon. Questions were asked gently where possible, because a photograph involving a child could unsettle any household. Most doors closed with nothing added except another line in the log. The bassinet box remained especially important because it appeared traceable. Detectives identified the store, the shipment, and the narrow period during which the bassinets had been sold, then tried to reconstruct who might have bought one. But customer identities weren't routinely recorded for small cash purchases, and a clerk couldn't be expected to remember every face from weeks earlier. The box led them close to commerce, but not close enough to a person. You might pause here over the texture of the original carton, because physical evidence from older cases carries time in a way typed summaries cannot. Cardboard absorbs dampness, dust, fingerprints, and the oils of handling, yet it also breaks down and gathers contamination. Every examination risks changing it slightly. The detectives of 1957 worked before modern evidence packaging standards, doing their best with the knowledge and materials available. The carton was examined for fingerprints, but no useful print emerged that could identify whoever had handled it. That result would have felt disappointing, though experienced investigators knew how often ordinary surfaces failed to preserve a clear pattern. Moisture, rough fibers, repeated handling, and outdoor exposure all interfered. You can see the powder brush move lightly across the surface, leaving only indistinct smudges beneath the examination lamp. The blanket was checked with similar care, and its origin was explored through manufacturers and textile knowledge. Yet mass-produced household goods seldom narrow themselves to one owner, especially after labels disappear and years soften their colors. The plaid could be described, photographed, and shown widely, but it couldn't remember the cupboard where it had rested. In the file, an intimate object became a public clue. As March arrived, the ground around Fox Chase began its slow seasonal change. Winter loosened, roadside mud deepened, and the air sometimes carried the clean metallic smell that comes before rain. The investigators continued returning to old leads while new calls arrived. You turn each page with them, noticing that patient work rarely follows the neat order later stories give it. A tip might revive an earlier question, sending an officer back to a school, a hospital, or a house already visited. Another caller might mention a child whose hair had recently been cut, or a family that had acquired a bassinet. Each detail needed context before it meant anything. A fact can sound important alone, but investigation asks whether it connects naturally with all the other facts. The detectives also had to consider whether Joseph came from outside Philadelphia. Roads and rail lines could carry people into the city from neighboring counties or farther away, and the absence of a local report didn't establish local origins. Notices therefore traveled beyond city boundaries, reaching other police departments and newspapers. You can imagine envelopes moving through sorting rooms, their corners softened by canvas mailbags and many careful hands. Responses returned gradually, sometimes days later, and sometimes after several weeks. An officer waiting for a distant agency couldn't open a screen and watch the status change. He could only continue with other work, then recognize the desired envelope when it appeared in the morning mail. The ZARELLI case grew in those intervals, through patient exchanges carried by trucks, trains, wires, and ringing telephones. Some leads concerned children who resembled the published image but were soon found safe. Those outcomes mattered, even though they didn't identify Joseph, because every located child closed one uncertainty for another family. Investigators recorded the resolution and moved onward. You can sense how their search widened into a map of many households, each with its own worries and ordinary evening light. Other leads arose from photographs mailed by families who feared the unknown child might be a relative they hadn't seen recently. Comparing such images demanded care, particularly when children were young and photographs scarce. Faces change with angle, expression, haircut, and the quality of a small snapshot. A detective might hold two prints beneath the same lamp, studying an ear or brow, while resisting the wish to see a match. Dental comparisons brought similar limitations. Joseph's teeth could be charted, but they were those of a very young child, and useful dental records weren't universal. Even where a child had seen a dentist, the records might remain in a private office unknown to police. You can almost smell the faint medicinal scent of an old dental room. Yet the chart needed a suspected identity before it could become truly useful. The investigation drew attention from law enforcement beyond Pennsylvania, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation helped circulate information. National exposure broadened the possible field, but it also increased the number of mistaken identifications that had to be examined. More attention created more work rather than immediate clarity. That pattern would repeat through later decades whenever the case returned to newspapers or television. For the detectives, patience wasn't passive waiting. It meant answering the same questions many times, comparing nearly identical forms, and treating each sincere caller with respect, even when the lead seemed unlikely. It meant returning to a shop after a clerk remembered something new, or checking whether an institutional record used another spelling. You sit beside that kind of effort tonight, where persistence feels less like motion and more like steady presence. Among those drawn deeply into the case was Remington Bristow, an investigator connected with the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office. His name would remain attached to the inquiry for decades, because he continued examining possibilities long after public attention had softened. You can imagine him at a desk after ordinary duties were complete, with a cup cooling nearby and photocopies arranged beneath a modest lamp. For Bristow, the unknown child became a lasting responsibility. He followed leads through neighborhoods, institutions, and family stories, repeatedly returning to the objects found near Susquehanna Road. The bassinet box, in particular, suggested a household connection that seemed always just beyond reach. Bristow understood that old cases often turn upon a detail overlooked, not through carelessness, but because its importance becomes visible only later. He kept looking for that later angle. One avenue concerned a foster home located not far from the discovery site. A sale at the property years later included objects that renewed Bristow's interest, among them a bassinet that appeared similar to the kind once packed inside the recovered carton. He also heard accounts involving blankets and children who had lived there. These circumstances invited attention, but circumstance and proof remain different things, and you can feel him working along that narrow line. The family associated with the home denied any connection to Joseph, and investigators didn't establish evidence sufficient to resolve the case through that theory. This is where a calm review matters most, because unsolved files easily gather stories that become firmer in repetition than they ever were in evidence. We can acknowledge why investigators looked without treating suspicion as certainty. The page remains open, where corroboration remains missing. Bristow continued because the possibility seemed meaningful to him, and because long investigations are often carried by people who cannot comfortably set aside one unanswered detail. Years passed. Offices changed, and colleagues retired. Yet, he returned to the file. Paper aged beneath his hands. Staples dulled, and photographs developed the faint silvering found in old prints. The work became part of the rhythm of his life. You can understand that rhythm without imagining obsession or drama. Sometimes a case remains because a person feels that someone should continue remembering when public attention moves elsewhere. Bristow couldn't give Joseph his name, but he could keep the questions from disappearing into storage. That quiet continuity would matter when later investigators inherited the record. Before those later years arrived, however, Philadelphia still had to decide how to lay the unknown child to rest. A local funeral home provided services, and money was gathered so that he wouldn't be buried without care. The ceremony was modest, attended by people who had never known him, but felt that his brief life deserved witness. You can hear subdued footsteps on cemetery grass and the low rustle of winter clothing. He was buried in a potter's field, where the marker carried a description rather than a birth name. Investigators and members of the public continued visiting, leaving flowers and small tokens through changing seasons. Even before his identity was known, strangers created a kind of community around his memory. It wasn't a substitute for family history, but it kept a place for him in the city. The case file, meanwhile, remained active in the patient sense of that word. Leads slowed, then rose again when a newspaper story stirred someone's recollection. Detectives changed assignments, and evidence moved between rooms, shelves, and custodians. You can almost feel the cool basement air around the boxes, with dust collecting along the lids and tight labels fading toward brown. But a file resting on a shelf isn't necessarily forgotten. Each preserved photograph, envelope, clipping, and report holds the possibility that a future method will ask a question the original investigators couldn't ask. In 1957, biological traces couldn't be translated into a family tree. The evidence waited, silently, for a scientific language that hadn't yet been written. Before that language arrived, the public search relied upon recognition, and recognition depended on someone knowing Joseph's face. Newspapers revisited the case on anniversaries, reproducing the familiar image and asking again whether anyone remembered. Each article sent another small wave of calls toward police. You return with us to those later clippings, their columns narrow and their paper soft at the folds. Some readers were children when the original posters appeared, and adults when they finally contacted investigators. They remembered the circular beside a grocery counter, or the way their parents lowered their voices when discussing the unknown boy. Such memories could preserve atmosphere more faithfully than detail. The face remained, while addresses, dates, and names gradually drifted beyond reach. That fading is one reason cold case work asks so much patience. A witness may carry a true memory whose edges have blurred, and an investigator must listen without forcing it into a shape the evidence doesn't support. You can imagine a quiet interview room, a tape recorder turning, while someone searches through 40 years of recollection. Silence in such a room isn't empty. It's part of the work. One later account came from a woman who said she had known the child under another first name and had witnessed events connected with his death. Her statement included details that investigators found worthy of serious attention, and detectives spent considerable time trying to test what she remembered. Yet, important parts couldn't be independently confirmed. The account therefore remained a lead rather than an established answer. The woman's personal history also led some people to dismiss her too quickly, while others accepted every detail without sufficient support. Patient investigation has to avoid both impulses. A witness deserves to be heard carefully, but a statement becomes evidence only where records, objects, or additional testimony can strengthen it. As you read that interview, you keep compassion beside caution. Investigators checked locations, spoke with neighbors, and looked for surviving documentation that might confirm the household arrangement she described. Decades had passed, leaving altered properties, lost records, and witnesses whose own memories had changed. The physical world she remembered no longer existed in quite the same way. You can feel the old neighborhood beneath the newer one, like writing faintly visible beneath a raised pencil. No conclusive corroboration emerged, and the account didn't provide the certainty needed to identify Joseph or determine responsibility for his death. That doesn't mean every part was necessarily false, only that the investigation couldn't carry it across the distance between possibility and proof. We leave it where the detectives had to leave it, carefully noted and unresolved. The file allows room for uncertainty without turning it into fact. Years later, another important change began when experienced investigators outside the police department gathered around the ZARELLI case and looked again at the aging evidence. The Vidocq Society, a Philadelphia-based group of forensic professionals and retired investigators, took an interest in the unidentified child during the 1990s. Its members brought experience from policing, medicine, law, psychology, and forensic science, offering their time to difficult, unsolved cases. Their meetings placed old mysteries beneath fresh eyes, often around tables where coffee cooled beside folders and legal pads. Joseph's file found another patient audience. Among those involved were people who understood that identification might someday depend upon biological evidence preserved from the child himself. DNA analysis had begun changing criminal investigation, though the methods of the 1990s were far more limited than those available decades later. Old remains presented special difficulties because time, soil, moisture, and earlier handling could damage genetic material. Still, the possibility was enough to justify care. In 1998, authorities exhumed the child's remains so that samples could be collected for DNA testing. Imagine the cemetery in muted daylight, the air cool, while professionals worked with deliberate respect and documented each step. This wasn't a reopening for spectacle. It was an effort to let science ask what paper records and public memory had been unable to answer. A mitochondrial DNA profile was developed from the material, giving investigators a new form of identifying information. Mitochondrial DNA passes through the maternal line, which can make it useful when samples are old or limited. But it doesn't identify one person by itself. A comparison is needed, usually from a possible maternal relative. You place that result into the file and notice that it was both valuable and incomplete, a new key without a known lock. The profile allowed investigators to test particular theories if a suitable relative could be located. Yet they still lacked a dependable candidate family, and genealogy databases weren't then capable of producing the broad network later investigators would use. The scientific result therefore waited alongside the older clues. Once again, the case had gained information without gaining a name. After the exhumation, the child was reburied at Ivy Hill Cemetery under the memorial name, America's Unknown Child. The new resting place was more accessible to visitors, and the grave received flowers, toys, and small notes from people moved by the case. You can imagine leaves shifting across the grass and the smooth stone cooling after sunset. His identity remained absent, but remembrance had become visible. The stone's words carried both care and limitation. They acknowledged that the child belonged to the human community, yet they couldn't say where he had been born, who had known him, or what name he once heard in daily life. For investigators, the marker was therefore not an ending. It was a promise written in granite that the search would continue. Through the following years, members of the Vidocq Society and Philadelphia investigators revisited possible matches and family accounts. They compared the mitochondrial profile when circumstances allowed, and they watched forensic science develop beyond what had seemed possible in 1998. New databases grew, laboratory methods became more sensitive, and genetic genealogy began joining DNA with traditional family research. You can hear the soft hum of newer equipment entering an old story. Yet technology doesn't simply arrive and solve a case by itself. Someone must decide that an old sample deserves another attempt, locate the surviving evidence, secure approval, choose an appropriate laboratory, and protect the integrity of every transfer. Each decision produces forms, signatures, sealed packages, and waiting periods. The remarkable result begins with ordinary administrative patience. By the late 2010s, genetic genealogy had demonstrated that distant family matches could help identify unknown people. Instead of requiring a direct comparison with a parent or sibling, investigators could sometimes work outward from second or third cousins, building family trees until separate branches converged. It was careful archival work as much as laboratory science. You might picture a screen glowing beside stacks of census pages, obituaries, marriage records, and handwritten charts. The old mitochondrial profile wasn't enough for this broader approach. Investigators needed a more detailed autosomal DNA profile, and the surviving biological material was badly degraded. The challenge would require specialists capable of recovering tiny fragments and arranging them into useful information. In the ZARELLI file, another long period of waiting was about to give way to work measured in molecules, family lines, and names copied carefully from one record to the next. The next stage began with a return to the cemetery, where the grass around the grave moved gently beneath a late-season breeze. In 2019, Joseph's remains were exhumed again, so that investigators could seek a better sample using newer laboratory methods. You can imagine the measured voices, the sealed containers, and the careful notation of every movement from one custodian to another. The process was quiet, formal, and filled with respect. Everyone involved understood that the available material was limited, and that an unsuccessful attempt might consume something that couldn't be replaced. This is one of the less visible burdens of old forensic work, because testing can require a small portion of the very evidence one hopes to preserve. Investigators had to weigh the promise of better science against the fragility of what remained. You sit with them at that decision point, where progress begins not with certainty, but with judgment. The samples carried the effects of more than 60 years underground, along with the complications created by earlier handling and testing. DNA naturally breaks into smaller pieces over time, and environmental conditions can make those fragments difficult to separate from contamination. A modern laboratory may detect material that once seemed unreachable, yet detection is only the beginning. The fragments must be cleaned, copied, measured, and assembled into a useful profile. If you picture the laboratory, let it remain calm and ordinary, with white work surfaces, labeled tubes, filtered air, and the steady hum of refrigeration. Technicians wear protective clothing, not because the room is dramatic, but because a stray skin cell can introduce genetic material from the present. Every tool is cleaned, every container marked, and every result examined for signs of interference. Precision lives in these small, repetitive rituals. The scientists working with Joseph's sample-faced material, described as severely degraded, meaning that much of the original genetic sequence had broken into short pieces. Ordinary methods weren't producing the dense profile needed for genealogical comparison, so the laboratory work had to be adjusted and repeated. You can imagine rows of data appearing slowly on a monitor, many positions blank, some uncertain, and a few clear enough to encourage another attempt. The answer existed in fragments, if those fragments could be made to align. This kind of recovery doesn't resemble the clean certainty often suggested by fictional laboratories. Results may arrive in partial batches, controls may fail, and contamination checks can require an entire process to begin again. A scientist can spend days preparing a sample only to learn that the useful signal remains too faint. Patient work means accepting that disappointment, documenting it, and returning with another carefully considered method. Colleen Fitzpatrick and the team at Identifinders International became involved in the genetic genealogy effort, working alongside Philadelphia investigators and forensic specialists. Genetic genealogist Misty Gillis took on much of the family tree research that would eventually connect the unknown profile to living relatives. Their task wasn't to search for the surname ZARELLI, because no one yet knew that name. They began only with genetic matches and the distant relationships those matches appeared to suggest. A match in a genealogy database doesn't arrive with a tidy message explaining the entire relationship. It may indicate that the unknown person shares a certain amount of DNA with someone whose family tree is incomplete, private, or partly mistaken. The researcher must estimate whether that person could be a cousin at one of several possible distances. You can see why the work needs both mathematics and the slower habits of an archivist. The amount of shared DNA is commonly measured in units called centimorgans, though the number rarely points to just one relationship. The same range might fit a second cousin, a first cousin twice removed, or another connection shaped by the structure of a particular family. Researchers, therefore, examine ages, locations, marriages, siblings, and migrations. A genetic hint becomes useful only when it rests within a believable human history. For Joseph's case, many of the initial matches were distant. Some led toward families with roots outside the United States, including branches connected to Italy, while others required long searches through American records. You can imagine the screen filled with unfamiliar surnames, each opening into birth notices, passenger lists, census pages, and cemetery records. No individual document held the answer, but together they began forming a map. The researchers built trees backward from living matches, searching for shared ancestors, and then brought those lines forward through their children and grandchildren. This movement through time can be slow, particularly when names recur across generations or appear with several spellings. A handwritten surname may be misread by a clerk, and an immigrant family may gradually change its spelling. You follow each line with a pencil, resisting the temptation to move faster than the records. Old census forms offered households frozen at 10-year intervals, but they couldn't show every relationship or explain what happened between enumerations. Marriage licenses joined families legally, while newspaper notices revealed siblings, cousins, and addresses omitted elsewhere. Obituaries often became especially useful because they gathered several generations into a few narrow columns. The soft crackle of a microfilm reader or the quiet click of a digital archive became part of Joseph's renewed investigation. Yet genealogical records reflect the customs and assumptions of their time. A birth outside marriage might be recorded discreetly. A child might live under a surname different from the one on a certificate, and informal caregiving could leave little documentation. Researchers had to remain sensitive to those possibilities without inventing connections unsupported by evidence. You can feel the tree expanding across the desk while several branches remain deliberately marked uncertain. The work also raised questions of privacy, because living people discovered through genetic research hadn't necessarily expected contact from homicide investigators. A distant cousin might have uploaded DNA simply to learn about ancestry, never imagining that the result could help identify a child from 1957. Investigators therefore approached potential relatives carefully and explained what assistance was being requested. Behind every database entry was a person with a family history of their own. Some relatives agreed to provide direct samples, allowing the genealogists to test whether a proposed branch was correct. A small cheek swab could confirm that researchers were moving toward the right family, or show that an apparently promising line needed to be reconsidered. The package would be labeled, sealed, and transported under documented conditions. You can hear the adhesive strip press closed, an ordinary sound carrying decades of possibility. When a comparison didn't fit, the researchers returned to their charts and looked again at every assumption. Perhaps a family tree contained an error. Perhaps a relationship wasn't biological. Or perhaps two people with similar names had been combined. Genetic genealogy requires a willingness to redraw the map repeatedly. A branch crossed out in pencil isn't wasted work. It protects the investigation from a mistaken identity. The emerging profile gradually led researchers toward one side of Joseph's biological family, though that achievement still didn't reveal which person within the family tree was his parent. Several siblings might fit by age and location, and official records were needed to narrow the field. You can picture a chart spread across several pages, its lines converging slowly toward Philadelphia. The city that had held the answer all along was becoming visible through kinship. Then the wider world slowed in 2020 as public offices closed or reduced access during the pandemic. Birth certificates, court files, and other records that might normally be requested through routine channels became harder to obtain. Researchers continued working from home, speaking by telephone, and sharing carefully controlled information. But some questions simply had to wait. The ZARELLI case had already endured long silences, and now another unexpected pause entered the file. That waiting wasn't empty, because family trees could still be checked, newspaper archives searched, and possible relationships compared. Yet the closed office door became a real boundary between a promising theory and documentary proof. You can imagine a records request resting in a quiet government building while dust settled on empty counters. Somewhere inside, a certificate may have carried the name investigators had sought since 1957, but access required time. When records became available, investigators obtained legal authority to examine birth, death, and adoption information connected with children born to the woman identified through the maternal line. This was sensitive work, involving people who had lived private lives and relatives who were still living. The purpose wasn't to expose a family, but to determine whether one child in those records matched the unknown boy. You turn these pages with the same care. Among the records was a birth certificate for Joseph Augustus ZARELLI, born on the 13th of January, 1953. His name had been there in official ink for nearly 7 decades, held within a system that couldn't previously connect it to the grave at Ivy Hill. The discovery must have felt both enormous and remarkably quiet. A typed line on aging paper had finally placed a possible name beside the genetic profile. But experienced investigators didn't announce the name when they first saw it. A certificate can contain an error, and a named parent on paper isn't always a biological parent. The genealogy had to support both sides of the proposed relationship, and direct comparisons were needed wherever possible. You can picture the name, written at the top of a working page, lightly underlined, with a question mark still beside Joseph. The surname on the certificate gave researchers a new direction, allowing them to examine the paternal family more closely. They built another set of branches, tracing relatives through public records and comparing the proposed relationships with the genetic matches. Some lines extended through Philadelphia neighborhoods, while others reached back through immigration records to earlier generations. The familiar name now emerging from the paperwork was ZARELLI. Living relatives from the paternal side were located and approached for assistance. Their samples could show whether the child's DNA truly belonged within that family, independent of what the birth certificate stated. This distinction mattered because a name written by a clerk could guide the inquiry without proving it. You wait with the investigators for the laboratory comparisons, hearing only the quiet ventilation of the evidence room and the turning of another page. The results supported the paternal relationship, while the maternal genealogy and official records supported the other side. 2 separate family lines now met in one child born in Philadelphia in January of 1953. The convergence was the strength of the identification, not any single clue viewed alone. You can imagine the family trees laid side by side, their many branches narrowing at last toward one small name. Investigators then searched for evidence that might contradict the proposed identity. They considered Joseph's age, birthplace, family connections, and the absence of any known record showing that he was alive after February of 1957. They reviewed the genetic calculations and asked other specialists to examine the work. Confirmation requires more than finding a satisfying answer. It requires trying patiently to prove that answer wrong. No contradiction displaced the conclusion, and the combined genetic and documentary evidence became strong enough for official acceptance. The medical examiner could amend the records that had once described an unidentified child. A number assigned in 1957 would now be associated with a birth name, a date, and a family lineage. You can sense how the cold language of administration began making room for a person. Still, the investigators faced another period of quiet preparation before telling the public. Living siblings and other relatives needed to be notified, both because the discovery concerned their family and because public attention could be intense. Some relatives had known nothing about Joseph's existence. A telephone call from an investigator could therefore alter their understanding of the past in a single, bewildering moment. There is no simple way to deliver information like that. The detective must explain the genetic evidence, the age of the case, and the difference between biological relationship and responsibility for what happened. Questions arise that the investigation may not yet answer, and silence on the telephone can become long. You sit nearby in imagination, allowing those families the privacy of their first response. Philadelphia police chose not to identify Joseph's parents publicly at the announcement, citing concern for living siblings on both sides. That restraint mattered, because biological kinship doesn't establish who cared for Joseph, where he lived throughout his childhood, or who was present near the end of his life. The family tree answered identity more clearly than circumstances. You keep those questions separate, as careful investigators must, leaving unsupported assumptions outside the file. News that the city's long unidentified child had been named began circulating shortly before the formal announcement. For people who had followed the case across decades, even the promise of a name carried deep emotional weight. Retired investigators, cemetery visitors, and members of the Vidocq Society had once wondered whether the answer would arrive within their lifetimes. Now, a press room was being prepared beneath bright lights and waiting cameras. On the 8th of December, 2022, Philadelphia officials gathered to tell the public that America's unknown child was Joseph Augustus ZARELLI. The room held the soft, mechanical noise of cameras adjusting focus and reporters arranging notebooks. Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw spoke of restoring the child's identity, while investigators described the long work that had made the announcement possible. You hear the name enter the public record clearly at last. Joseph. He had been 4 years old, not an ageless symbol or an anonymous figure from an old newspaper. He had been born in Philadelphia and had living relatives connected to both sides of his family. His birthplace and family lines now replaced the broad guesses that had accumulated since 1957. As you turn the amended page, the case feels different, although it isn't finished. The announcement solved one of the investigation's 2 central questions. Detectives knew who Joseph was, but they still didn't know enough to state publicly who had caused his death or why his absence had never produced a missing child report. Identity reopened the timeline rather than closing it. A name provided addresses, relatives, and records that couldn't have been searched while he remained unknown. Captain Jason Smith explained that the homicide investigation remained active and that police still needed information about Joseph's life. Investigators had ideas about who might have been responsible, but they wouldn't name a suspect without sufficient evidence. Most people directly involved in 1957 were likely no longer alive, making definitive proof especially difficult. You can feel the restraint in that position, a refusal to substitute public speculation for evidence. The name also changed the way the oldest documents could be read. A report that once described only physical features could now be placed beside a birth date and possible family address. Investigators could search directories, school records, medical files, church documents, and neighborhood memories using Joseph's actual identity. You return to the first pages and notice that each old sentence now points toward a more specific world. Police said Joseph had connections to West Philadelphia and had lived near the intersection of 61st and Market Streets. That placed his early life far across the city from the Fox Chase roadside where he was found. Between those locations stretched trolley routes, row houses, shops, churches, and neighborhoods changing from block to block. You can trace the distance on a folded street map, your finger moving quietly from west to northeast across Philadelphia. The journey between those areas became another question within the file. Investigators needed to understand whether Joseph had actually lived with either biological parent, had stayed with relatives, or had entered some informal or institutional care arrangement. A birth certificate establishes arrival, not the shape of a childhood. You can hear papers shifting as detectives begin assembling the missing 4 years between January of 1953 and February of 1957. Those years were brief in a calendar, yet difficult to reconstruct after so much time. Adults who might have remembered Joseph as a neighbor, patient, or family acquaintance had died, while surviving witnesses had been young themselves. Buildings had changed use, medical practices had closed, and private records had been discarded. The investigation now possessed a name, but much of the world around that name had become quiet. City directories could show which adults lived at particular addresses, though they didn't reliably list young children. Census records weren't available at the necessary interval, and school enrollment might offer little because Joseph hadn't reached the usual age for formal schooling. Church baptismal registers, hospital files, and welfare records could help, but only if he had entered those systems under the same name. You examine each possibility without assuming the path. The birth certificate indicated that Joseph's biological parents weren't married to each other when he was born. In the social climate of the early 1950s, that circumstance could have been surrounded by secrecy, private arrangements, or pressure from relatives. Yet it doesn't tell us where Joseph lived or who cared for him. You keep the document flat beneath your hand, allowing it to say only what it can support. Public interest quickly moved toward the identities of the parents, and names were reported by journalists using records and interviews. That attention brought painful speculation toward surviving relatives, many of whom had never known Joseph and couldn't answer what had happened. Investigators cautioned that connection through DNA wasn't evidence of involvement in his death. The calmest reading of the ZARELLI case keeps family relationships separate from blame. Several living relatives issued statements expressing sympathy for Joseph and distress over assumptions aimed at their families. Some said they had received very little information from police and were trying to understand the genetic conclusions themselves. You can imagine them encountering family names in headlines, then opening old albums in search of a face they had never seen. Identification restored Joseph's place in a family tree, but it also sent difficult questions through its living branches. This human consequence is part of modern genetic genealogy, especially when an identification reaches into families unaware of the underlying history. A researcher may solve one form of absence while creating a sudden need for explanation among strangers linked by biology. Ethical practice asks for accuracy, restraint, and empathy at every step. You remain beside the file, aware that truth can arrive gently and still feel heavy. For police, the announcement produced new tips. As investigators had hoped, people searched family memories, compared dates, and contacted the department with information that might relate to Joseph's early years. Each lead required the same basic discipline used in 1957: record it, test it, and compare it with what was already known. New technology had identified Joseph, but old-fashioned interviewing remained essential. A caller's story might involve a household in West Philadelphia, a child seen briefly, or an adult whose life intersected with one of Joseph's parents. Investigators would need to establish whether the memory came from personal experience or from details absorbed after the announcement. Publicity can awaken genuine recollection, but it can also reshape memory around recently learned facts. You listen for the small, unprompted details that carry the texture of something truly remembered. Such details might include the arrangement of a room, the sound of a family nickname, or the location of a shop no longer standing. They still require corroboration, because vividness isn't the same as accuracy. A witness may sincerely place an event in the wrong year or attach the right memory to the wrong child. The detective's task is to preserve the account without pressing it into a convenient shape. The location near 61st and Market offered a starting point for neighborhood research. In the early 1950s, Market Street carried the sounds of streetcars, buses, shop doors, and conversations rising from busy pavements. Row houses stood close together, and neighbors could notice the routines of nearby families without knowing their private circumstances. You can imagine winter coal smoke hanging lightly in the air, while a child's presence passed unnoticed by official records. If Joseph lived there, someone may have seen him near a window, on a front step, or beside an adult entering a store. Yet, the announcement came nearly 70 years later, when most such observations had faded or died with those who held them. Detectives searched for witnesses who had been children or adolescents at the time. An elderly person's small memory could still place Joseph within a particular home. The work required tact, because old neighborhoods gather stories that can mingle across households and decades. One family's move may be confused with another's, and a remembered child may have been a cousin visiting for only a week. Investigators ask for photographs, letters, calendars, or surviving address books that might steady the account. You can feel the worn cover of such a book, its penciled telephone numbers carrying traces of a vanished network. Photographs became especially important after Joseph had a name. Family collections might contain birthday gatherings, holiday tables, or casual outdoor scenes where a child appeared at the edge of the frame. A small face overlooked for decades could become meaningful when compared with the reconstructed image and genetic history. You hold an imaginary snapshot by its white border, careful not to leave fingerprints on the glossy surface. But no verified childhood photograph of Joseph was publicly presented with the identification announcement. The familiar images remained those created after his discovery, and the later forensic reconstructions intended to show his likely appearance. That absence left investigators without an ordinary portrait taken while he was alive. A name had been restored, while the everyday face belonging to that name remained partly beyond reach. The lack of a missing person report also gained new meaning. Police could now search specifically for any document suggesting that Joseph had been reported under another name or described without formal identification. They could examine whether an institution expected him, whether medical care had been recorded, or whether relatives believed he was living elsewhere. You see how a child can disappear administratively when each adult assumes another household holds the answer. Informal care arrangements were not uncommon, especially when families faced financial pressure, illness, social stigma, or unstable housing. A child might stay with grandparents, extended relatives, or unrelated caregivers for months without a court becoming involved. Such an arrangement could be understood differently by each person participating in it. The ZARELLI investigators needed to reconstruct not only an address, but the private agreements surrounding Joseph's care. Records from social service agencies could have helped, though confidentiality rules and retention practices complicated access. Some documents may never have existed, while others may have been destroyed according to ordinary schedules long before Joseph was identified. Investigators had to determine what collections survived and where they had been transferred. You can almost smell the cool, dry air of a municipal archive as a staff member opens another labeled carton. Hospital records offered another avenue, because the original medical examination suggested that Joseph may previously have received medical attention. Yet a young child's records from the early 1950s might be filed under a parent, an address, or a slightly different surname. Hospitals merged, offices closed, and paper charts were routinely discarded after prescribed periods. Each possible institution became another corridor lined with closed doors and possibilities. The investigators could also compare Joseph's known physical history with records retained by pediatric practices or charitable clinics. A distinctive treatment or documented condition might create a match if the right archive survived. But medicine in that era wasn't centrally indexed, and confidentiality still governed any surviving files. You wait beside the researchers as they submit careful requests, knowing that a reply may take weeks and contain only a polite absence. Church records sometimes survive where official or medical records do not. A baptismal entry may list parents, sponsors, and an address, while parish registers can preserve family relationships across several generations. Investigators and genealogists understand the quiet value of these handwritten books. You can picture a parish office with waxed wooden floors and a ledger whose pages release a faint smell of dust and ink. If Joseph was baptized, the entry might reveal who presented him and which adults considered themselves part of his early life. Yet even that wouldn't necessarily show where he lived later, or how he came to be separated from the people named. Records capture moments, not every change that follows them. The case demanded a continuous timeline, while history offered only scattered points of light. Newspaper archives could provide small domestic announcements, although a child born outside marriage might not have appeared in a social column. Researchers searched legal notices, household addresses, family obituaries, and community reports for indirect references. The process resembles assembling a room from reflections seen in several windows. You learn the surrounding family's movements, while Joseph himself remains just beyond the frame. The genealogist's work had already demonstrated how much could be recovered from indirect evidence. They hadn't begun with Joseph's name, but with distant cousins whose relationships led toward common ancestors. Now homicide detectives faced a similar task with ordinary life records, reconstructing Joseph through the adults and places around him. The method remained patient, begin at the edges, then move carefully toward the center. One address could lead to a landlord's records, a neighbor's descendants, or a city permit showing who occupied a building. A family name could lead to an employment file or union record that established where an adult worked during the relevant period. Transportation routes might explain how one neighborhood connected with another. You unfold the city map again, listening to the dry creases settle across the desk. The distance from West Philadelphia to Fox Chase wasn't impossible by car, but it was significant enough to invite questions about familiarity. Investigators would consider who knew the roadside area, who traveled there, and whether any household connection existed nearby. They would also avoid assuming that the discovery place reflected Joseph's residence. A location can mark only the final movement of evidence, not the earlier geography of a life. Susquehanna Road itself had changed since 1957, as development altered the landscape and erased some of the open ground visible in old photographs. Investigators studying the site decades later relied on maps, property records, and contemporary images to understand where paths and buildings once stood. You can overlay the old view upon the present one, aligning a bend in the road and the line of distant trees. Weather records could help estimate the conditions around the time Joseph was found, though they couldn't identify who had traveled there. Newspaper reports described winter temperatures and the state of the ground, while photographs preserved the bare vegetation. Such context may assist with interpreting physical evidence, but it rarely supplies a name on its own. You feel the cold through the grainy image, then return to the warmer archive room. The original box continued to connect the roadside with domestic life. After Joseph's identification, detectives could ask whether anyone in either biological family had purchased or received a bassinet during the relevant months. The carton had once carried an object associated with an infant, yet there was no certainty that the person who used the box had purchased the bassinet. It could have been borrowed, discarded, or passed between households. Tracing that possibility after 65 years was extraordinarily difficult. Store employees were gone. Most purchasers had died, and no complete sales ledger connected individual bassinets to names. Family photographs might show a similar bassinet, but appearance alone wouldn't prove that its carton became evidence. You can see why detectives returned to the box with interest, while refusing to let it promise more than it can deliver. The blanket presented the same mixture of intimacy and anonymity. Someone had washed it, folded it, and kept it within a home before it entered the investigation, yet its pattern was sold widely enough to resist ownership. After Joseph was named, relatives could be shown the fabric again, though memory across generations would remain uncertain. A familiar plaid might belong to hundreds of cupboards, bedrooms, and winter nights. Forensic testing on old fabric can sometimes recover biological material, but decades of handling create difficult mixtures. Police, medical personnel, laboratory workers, and others may all have touched evidence before modern contamination precautions existed. A profile found today must therefore be interpreted against documented handling history. You imagine the blanket sealed inside protective packaging, its faded threads carrying more contact than one laboratory can easily separate. The hair clippings also remained a curious feature. Investigators in 1957 believed Joseph's hair had been cut recently, perhaps shortly before he was found, and they wondered whether the cutting occurred as part of routine care or for another reason. After identification, that detail could be asked of relatives or connected with medical records. Yet no public evidence established who held the scissors or where the haircut took place. A simple haircut leaves few documents. It lives in memory, in stray hairs swept from a floor, and perhaps in a photograph taken near the same time. If everyone present is gone, the detail becomes almost weightless, despite its apparent closeness to the child. You can hear the soft metallic opening of scissors in imagination. Then the sound disappears into the room's silence. Detectives also reviewed the original timing estimates, trying to place Joseph's death within a manageable period before the discovery. In an old case, even a small refinement could help compare household events, travel, hospital visits, or changes in routine. But medical estimates from 1957 had natural limits, especially after outdoor exposure. The The timeline remained a range rather than a precise mark on the clock. That uncertainty affected witness interviews. Someone might remember a child being present early in February, but not recall the exact final day, while another person could confuse one winter with the next. Investigators looked for anchors such as holidays, paydays, storms, births, or moves. You know how memory sometimes attaches itself to the smell of snow or the sound of a radio program more readily than to a date. Family documents could provide those anchors. A letter mentioning illness, a photograph developed during a particular month, or a receipt from a journey might quietly fix an adult's location. Most such materials were never created with investigation in mind. They survived in drawers because someone valued the handwriting, the stamp, or the ordinary event recorded on paper. When detectives speak with descendants, they may ask about boxes of family possessions that haven't been opened for years. Inside could be address books, photographs without names, condolence cards, or legal papers folded into brittle envelopes. The search requires patience from the family as well as the investigator. You can imagine the soft lift of a cardboard lid and the dry scent of a cedar-lined closet. Every discovered document would still need authentication and context. A name on the back of a photograph may have been added decades later, while a date could refer to printing rather than when the picture was taken. Detectives compare handwriting, paper stock, photographic format, and the people visible in the image. The smallest domestic artifact can become useful only through careful comparison. The identification also allowed forensic artists to revisit their earlier reconstructions. They could compare estimated age and features with information from Joseph's biological relatives, though public discussion remained limited to protect the family. Facial reconstruction is never a portrait, but a reasoned approximation built from anatomy, age, and available evidence. You look at the successive images as attempts to invite recognition, each shaped by the tools of its time. The earliest photograph reached people because nothing else existed, while later drawings and digital images tried to present a gentler, more familiar face. In 2016, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an updated reconstruction and added the case to its public database. That image renewed attention several years before genetic genealogy restored Joseph's name. The path to identification included many such acts of renewed visibility. Each public renewal brought volunteers, researchers, and retired investigators back towards the file. Some searched newspaper archives, while others compared missing child records or helped maintain Joseph's grave. Their efforts varied in usefulness, but the continuing interest ensured the case wasn't reduced to a forgotten number. You can sense a long chain of people passing the folder forward, each holding it for a while. The Vidocq Society played an important role in maintaining that continuity. Its members approached the case with professional experience, but also with the understanding that official agencies have limited time and many current demands. By gathering specialists around an old file, the Society created space for questions that required years rather than days. The meeting room became another kind of archive, filled with voices, folders, and patience. Remington Bristow didn't live to hear Joseph's name announced. He died in 1993, after spending much of his adult life pursuing the case. Yet the questions he preserved helped keep attention fixed on the unidentified child. Later investigators inherited both his careful work and the theories that still required testing. You can imagine his notes among the records, the handwriting steady, even where the answer remained distant. Other investigators also retired or died before the identification, which gave the 2022 announcement a sense of shared work extending beyond those present. No single detective could claim the solution. Police officers, medical examiners, genealogists, laboratory technicians, archivists, journalists, cemetery workers, and cooperative relatives had all contributed something. The name emerged from a long accumulation of effort. That accumulation is what it was like to investigate the ZARELLI case. Long intervals when nothing appeared to move, followed by a new method that made old evidence speak differently. A box, traced to a store. A blanket shown across a city. A DNA fragment recovered from aged material. And a birth certificate opened decades later, all belonged to the same inquiry. You remain at the desk, while these layers settle gently over one another, page upon page. After the announcement, however, the homicide detectives had to move beyond the achievement of identification and return to the unfinished timeline. They needed to know who had custody of Joseph, where he slept, which adults saw him regularly, and when he was last known to be alive. These questions couldn't be answered by genetic kinship alone. The family trees now had to be joined to the ordinary routines of a 4-year-old child. Investigators began again with addresses, interviews, and records, using the restored name to revisit every surviving piece of evidence. The work carried them away from the bright press room and back toward quiet offices where maps lay open beneath the evening lights. Outside, Philadelphia traffic moved through streets Joseph might once have known. Inside, a detective drew another line between West Philadelphia and Fox Chase, then reached for the next folder. The next folder contained street directories, property maps, and copies of records gathered after Joseph's identification, each page connecting a person to a place for only one narrow season. In the ZARELLI case, an address could be accurate without revealing who actually stayed there each night. Families visited, children moved between relatives, and lodgers sometimes appeared nowhere in the formal record. You follow the penciled lines carefully, looking for routine rather than certainty. A city directory might list the head of a household and an occupation, but omit a young mother, an elderly grandparent, or every child beneath the roof. Telephone books favored people who maintained service in their own names, leaving many adults invisible. Investigators therefore placed different records beside one another, hoping their gaps wouldn't overlap. The quiet work resembled laying thin sheets of tracing paper over the same street. Property records established owners, while voter registrations and employment files sometimes showed who received mail at an address. Newspaper advertisements revealed nearby businesses, and transit maps explained how residents crossed the city. None of those sources mentioned Joseph directly, yet they reconstructed the landscape through which the adults around him moved. You can hear the trolley wheels turning beyond the archive window as the neighborhood returns, faintly, to life. Near 61st and Market, the elevated railway cast changing shadows over the pavement, and storefronts served families living in the surrounding blocks. The air would have carried engine exhaust, bakery warmth, wet wool, and the mineral smell of winter streets. A child in that neighborhood might have been known to a grocer or watched from a neighboring stoop. Investigators sought those small circles of familiarity. Most witnesses with adult memories of 1953 were no longer available by 2022. Detectives instead spoke with people who had been young then, asking what they remembered about particular households and relatives. Childhood memory can preserve a room's wallpaper or an adult's voice, while losing the order of events. You listen beside the detective as each recollection is allowed to arrive at its own pace. The questions had to be open enough to avoid planting details. Rather than asking whether someone remembered Joseph, an interviewer might first ask which children lived on a certain block and who regularly visited. Only after the witness described the household would the investigator introduce more specific information. This protects the memory from being shaped by the question, and it protects the file from false confidence. A witness might remember a small boy, but be unsure whether he lived there or visited from another part of the city. Another might recall a stroller, a bassinet, or a child carried up steps, yet place the memory in the wrong year. Detectives compared those accounts with births, leases, and family events. You can feel how each recollection must rest against something firmer before it becomes useful. The biological parents' separate family histories received close attention, though investigators remained cautious about assuming either parent had raised Joseph. A birth certificate could indicate biology and legal acknowledgement without documenting daily care. Relatives might also have believed that Joseph was living safely with someone else. The central question remained not merely who his parents were, but who knew the truth of his whereabouts. This distinction protected living families from conclusions unsupported by the evidence. It also kept investigators focused on the many forms caregiving could take during the early 1950s. A child might be placed with relatives temporarily, entrusted to acquaintances, or sent through an arrangement remembered differently by every adult involved. You mark these possibilities in the margin, but leave each one in pencil. Researchers searched for adoption proceedings because a formal placement could explain the separation between Joseph's birth record and later household. Philadelphia police obtained access to protected records connected with the maternal line, yet no public announcement established a completed adoption that explained his life. Informal transfers were harder to trace. If no court, agency, or physician recorded the change, only human memory might once have held the path. Institutions also had to be considered, including children's homes, religious charities, hospitals, and temporary care facilities. Investigators in 1957 had checked many such places, usually by circulating descriptions and asking whether a child was missing. After 2022, they could ask the narrower question of whether Joseph Augustus ZARELLI had ever appeared in surviving records. A name changed the search from broad recognition to specific verification. Even then, spelling posed difficulties. Joseph's middle name might be abbreviated, the surname might be entered incorrectly, or a caregiver might have used another name altogether. Clerks working quickly could transpose letters or record what they heard through a counter window. You can picture the scratch of a fountain pen over a form, creating a small variation that later hides one record from another record. Researchers therefore searched phonetic spellings, initials, addresses, and the names of relatives. They examined indexes page by page, when digital searches returned nothing. This is where an archivist's patience becomes as important as a detective's instinct. A misfiled card can remain unseen for decades until someone opens the correct drawer and notices the handwriting. But the surviving public account hasn't established a confirmed institution where Joseph lived. That absence leaves the investigators with several possible household arrangements and very little direct testimony. They know where his biological lines begin, but not the full route his childhood followed. As you sit with this section, the map contains more blank space than ink. Years earlier, before Joseph's identification, detectives had explored reports involving foster homes and private caregiving. Those old inquiries now had to be reconsidered in light of the genetic findings, not simply accepted or discarded because they were familiar. A theory developed around an unknown child may change when the child's birth family becomes known. You reopen the older folder and feel its stiffened paper resist slightly at the fold. One long-standing theory focused on the foster home near the discovery area that Remington Bristow had examined so persistently. The presence of a similar bassinet and other circumstances had seemed meaningful, yet no conclusive physical or documentary link was established. Joseph's restored identity allowed detectives to ask whether either biological family had any connection to that household. Public information hasn't shown that such a connection was proved. The responsible approach is to leave that theory in its evidentiary place. It explains why investigators spent time there, but not who cared for Joseph or who caused his death. Old cases often collect a leading theory because it provides structure to uncertainty. You can appreciate the work behind it, while keeping the word unconfirmed close by. Another account, offered decades after the discovery, described Joseph as having lived under a different first name, with a family outside his biological home. The witness gave a detailed narrative, including information that seemed to resemble facts not widely emphasized at the time. Investigators traveled, interviewed her, and examined the places she described. Yet they couldn't find independent evidence strong enough to establish the account as history. After Joseph was identified, researchers naturally asked whether the witness's story could fit his actual family lines or childhood circumstances. A correct identification might support or weaken portions of an older statement, depending on dates and relationships. But resemblance alone still wouldn't be enough. You place the interview transcript beside the genealogy and wait for a documented bridge that has not publicly appeared. The witness's use of another name doesn't settle the issue either, because children in informal care sometimes use nicknames or household surnames. At the same time, an incorrect name makes confirmation harder when no school, doctor, or agency recorded the child under it. Detectives must consider both possibilities without choosing one from sympathy or suspicion. The measured word remains possible. Other theories came from people who believed the box might have been connected with a family welcoming a new infant. Since the carton had held a bassinet, researchers examined births and households that might have obtained such an item. Yet cardboard boxes are commonly reused for storage, moving, or disposal long after their original purchase. You can see why the printed label attracts attention while still refusing to identify its final handler. Investigators, in 1957, traced the bassinet model to a limited shipment, which made the carton feel unusually promising. They questioned store employees and attempted to identify purchasers, but small retail sales often left no customer record. Decades later, that gap couldn't be repaired through technology. The cash register had rung. A box had left the shop and the name of the buyer vanished into ordinary commerce. A family photograph showing the same bassinet model could become interesting, though thousands of similar household objects appeared in mid-century albums. Detectives would need features unique to the exact item, along with a credible chain connecting its carton to Susquehanna Road. Without that, visual similarity remains only a starting point. You turn the photograph toward the lamplight and resist the comfort of an easy match. The blanket inspired similar public efforts, with people comparing old fabrics and family possessions to the plaid pattern. Textile experts could sometimes narrow a weave to a manufacturer or period, but they couldn't always identify a single retailer or purchaser. Household textiles moved through donations, second-hand shops, and relatives. A blanket may stay within one family for years, or change homes without leaving any record. Forensic examination might reveal fibers, hairs, or environmental traces, yet the age and handling history of the evidence complicate every result. Investigators would have to distinguish material present in 1957 from material introduced during recovery, storage, display, or earlier testing. The evidence was collected before DNA contamination became a familiar concern. You imagine each later examiner listed in a growing elimination file. Elimination samples can help identify genetic material belonging to officers, laboratory personnel, or others who handled an item. But collecting such samples from people who worked the case many decades ago may be impossible. Some are deceased, and documentation of every contact may be incomplete. The modern laboratory, therefore, interprets any mixed profile with patient restraint, aware of the long and complicated journey. This problem illustrates why evidence preservation matters even when current science cannot use an item fully. Future methods may separate mixtures or recover information that today remains indistinct. At the same time, each generation must avoid consuming too much material in pursuit of an uncertain result. The ZARELLI case has always involved this conversation between present opportunity and future possibility. Investigators also revisited fingerprints associated with the box and surrounding materials, although no usable unknown print had emerged originally. Modern enhancement can sometimes reveal patterns missed by older techniques, but porous cardboard exposed to weather is an unforgiving surface. Moisture spreads residues through the fibers, while handling overlays one impression with another. You can almost feel the softened carton beneath a gloved finger. No database, however large, can compare a pattern that was never preserved clearly enough to classify. This is a quiet limitation of technology that investigators understand well. The computer can search millions of records rapidly, but only after a human examiner determines that the evidence contains stable ridge detail. In this part of the file, the old result remains inconclusive. The same careful distinction applies to the scene itself. The roadside location might have contained discarded objects unrelated to Joseph, and officers had to decide which items deserved collection. An abandoned glove or bottle can appear meaningful only because it lies near something important. You walk the old scene with them, noticing damp leaves, rusted metal, wind-blown paper, and the difficulty of separating evidence from background. Photographs preserve the arrangement as officers found it, though black and white images compress colors and distances. A slope may seem steeper, a tree closer, or a roadway narrower, depending on the lens. Detectives studying those photographs years later compare them with measurements and maps. The image is a record, but it isn't the place itself. The discovery site was near a roadway used by local residents, tradespeople, and anyone traveling between nearby communities. Investigators sought people familiar with the area, including those who walked, drove, worked, or visited there during February of 1957. Some remembered seeing the carton before police arrived. Determining when it appeared could narrow the timeline, but recollections differed and required caution. A cardboard box beside a road isn't unusual enough to fix itself immediately in memory. Someone may pass it several times before learning that it mattered, then unintentionally revise the remembered date. Detectives compare weather, work schedules, and travel routines to test such statements. You hear an elderly witness pause over the calendar, trying to recall whether the ground was frozen that morning. The young man who reported the discovery also became part of the inquiry because he had delayed contacting police. Investigators examined his explanation and circumstances, as they would with anyone closely connected to the first report. The delay attracted speculation, but suspicion alone didn't establish involvement. You read the interview and allowed the investigators' eventual judgment to remain grounded in what they could verify. His presence in the area was connected with checking small animal traps, an activity he feared might bring unwanted attention. That concern reportedly contributed to his hesitation. before making the call. Once he did report what he had seen, officers could begin the investigation. The human element is quietly ordinary. Fear of embarrassment or minor trouble can delay an act someone knows is necessary. Early detectives also considered whether another person had encountered the scene before the official report. Accounts emerged of people passing the area and noticing a vehicle or unusual activity, though no such observation conclusively identified who brought Joseph there. Memories gathered after publicity can be sincere and still incomplete. You place each statement on the timeline with a dotted line rather than a solid one. Vehicle descriptions were especially difficult to use when colors, makes, and dates varied. Mid-century cars shared broad shapes, and a witness seeing one briefly through bare branches might recall little beyond size or tone. Registration searches required a dependable description and a manageable geographic range. Without those, the lead expanded faster than officers could reasonably check. The police nevertheless followed vehicle information when details permitted, contacting owners and comparing their movements with the estimated timeline. Each inquiry involved paper registration files, telephone calls, and in-person interviews. You can hear keys turning in metal filing cabinets, and the low murmur of officers reading plate numbers aloud. The process was slow because every comparison required a human hand. Modern detectives reviewing those efforts can see which vehicles were eliminated and which descriptions remained unresolved. They can also recognize where records no longer exist, closing avenues that once might have been explored further. Cold case work isn't only about discovering new possibilities. It is also about understanding which old opportunities have been permanently lost. That knowledge can feel heavy, yet it prevents wasteful repetition. A clearly documented interview from 1957 may be the only surviving voice of a witness who died long ago. If the questions were thorough, later detectives can still learn from it. You rest your hand near the typed transcript, grateful for every precise date, description, and pause. Transcripts sometimes include the interviewer's observations about tone or hesitation, but those impressions must be treated cautiously. Nervousness can come from many sources, including grief, fear of police, or simple discomfort in an unfamiliar room. It doesn't prove deception. Patient investigators look instead for contradictions that can be checked against independent facts. The original case generated thousands of tips, and managing them became an investigation in itself. Each caller needed a record, each record a reference number, and each plausible lead an assigned follow-up. Paper systems could duplicate work when names were spelled differently or reports filed under separate categories. You can imagine index cards filling drawers, their upper corners darkened by repeated touch. Later, investigators digitized portions of those records, making it easier to search addresses, surnames, and recurring details. Optical character recognition could assist with typed pages, though faded carbon copies and handwritten notes still required manual review. A machine might read a letter incorrectly and hide the very name being sought. Human eyes remained essential beneath the cool glow of the screen. Once Joseph's name became known, a targeted search across the digitized tips could reveal whether anyone had mentioned ZARELLI or a related family before 2022. Such a discovery would be important because it preceded public knowledge of the name. Investigators would then locate the original caller, learn the source of the information, and determine why it hadn't produced identification earlier. You can feel the search cursor waiting beside the surname like a small lamp. No publicly released account has described a decisive early tip naming Joseph. That doesn't mean the name never appeared somewhere in the mass of material. only that investigators haven't announced such a finding. An old misspelling or indirect reference could still be hidden in an unindexed page. The file's size turns absence into something that must be established slowly, not merely assumed. The genealogical identification itself supplied a useful model for reviewing the tips. Researchers had succeeded by connecting weak signals across different records, rather than waiting for one perfect match. Detectives could apply the same habit to witness statements, grouping repeated addresses, occupations, and relationships. A detail dismissed alone may gain weight when it appears independently in several places. Still, patterns can arise by coincidence, particularly in a large city and an enormous file. Common surnames, ordinary vehicles, and widely sold household goods produce apparent connections without a shared cause. Investigators test whether the timing and geography also agree. You draw two lines toward the same point, then check whether they truly meet or only cross on paper. The revived investigation also involved forensic review of Joseph's original medical findings. Modern specialists could examine photographs, radiographs, and notes using knowledge unavailable in 1957. Their purpose wasn't to revisit painful detail for its own sake, but to understand his health history and identify signs of earlier care. A healed condition might point toward a hospital, physician, or household that once sought treatment. Such review could also refine estimates of age, nutrition, or the timing of particular changes. Yet the original examination was performed competently within the standards of its period, and modern interpretation remained bound by the surviving records. No new specialist could observe what hadn't been photographed or preserved. You hear the quiet turning of medical pages, each diagram carrying both information and limits. Investigators publicly indicated that Joseph had experienced hardship before his death, but they avoided releasing every detail while the homicide inquiry remained open. That restraint protected the integrity of witness interviews, because certain facts could be used to evaluate whether a caller possessed genuine knowledge. If everything became public, investigators would lose that testing tool. Silence could therefore serve the case, rather than conceal neglect. Hold back information has long been part of careful detective work. A true witness or responsible person may mention something never printed, giving investigators a reason to listen more closely. But even accurate private detail doesn't automatically prove the entire account. It becomes another point requiring corroboration, and you mark it with measured attention. The 2022 announcement revealed enough about the genetic process to establish confidence in Joseph's identity, while withholding family details relevant to the homicide. This balance frustrated people eager for a complete story, but investigators weren't producing a finished historical narrative. They were preserving an active case. You sit with that difference, understanding that public curiosity and evidentiary responsibility move at different speeds. Journalists continued investigating the family history and reported probable identities for Joseph's biological parents. Their work used public documents, interviews, and information from people familiar with the genealogy. It added context, but it also encouraged online speculation about people who could no longer respond. A calm review keeps reported family structure separate from any claim of criminal responsibility. The biological father's surviving children, born in a later marriage, said through representatives that they had no knowledge of Joseph. Their lack of knowledge was entirely possible, given the timing of his birth and the private circumstances surrounding it. Family trees contain branches that grow unaware of one another. You can imagine an album beginning years later with no photograph or note, revealing the earlier child. Relatives connected to the maternal side faced similar disruption when the identification became public. Some had known fragments of family history, while others apparently hadn't known Joseph existed. Investigators needed their cooperation without placing upon them responsibility inherited through DNA. Kinship can help solve an identity, but guilt doesn't pass through a family line. This principle mattered deeply in the ZARELLI case because the genetic method necessarily led police through living relatives. Those relatives served as reference points, not suspects merely by agreeing to provide samples. Their cooperation helped restore Joseph's name after 65 years. You pause over that contribution, quiet and largely private, because it was an act of considerable generosity. The genealogists also carried an unusual emotional burden. They spent months learning the shapes of families whose members they might never meet, while knowing that the result concerned a child denied his name for decades. Every promising branch raised hope, and every failed comparison required detachment. Their work demanded empathy without allowing empathy to bend the analysis. Misty Gillis described building outward through distant matches until likely maternal relatives emerged. The process required tracing numerous siblings and descendants, then checking which women fit Joseph's birth date and location. Researchers sometimes discover that an apparent family tree omits a relationship known only through DNA. You can see the chart being revised, its clean lines giving way to the complexity of actual lives. When the maternal family narrowed sufficiently, investigators used legal records to identify children born during the relevant years. Joseph's certificate then introduced the paternal surname, but the researchers still sought genetic confirmation from that side. This two-part method guarded against error in the document. The answer became dependable because paper and biology pointed toward the same child. The identification was therefore not a sudden flash of recognition. It was a slow convergence produced by laboratory recovery, database comparison, genealogical construction, court-authorized records, direct family testing, and independent review. Each stage depended upon the accuracy of the one before it. You walk through them in order, hearing no dramatic music, only keyboards, printers, telephones, and patient voices. The laboratory recovery may have been the most technically difficult stage because Joseph's DNA was so fragmented. Specialists had to obtain enough genetic markers for meaningful database matching, a task requiring methods more sensitive than those used in 1998. The usable profile emerged after repeated effort rather than a single clean test. In the fluorescent stillness of the laboratory, persistence became a form of craft. Data from the sample then had to be evaluated for quality before any genealogy could begin. Missing positions, possible contamination, and statistical uncertainty all affected which matches could be trusted. Researchers couldn't treat every shared segment as equally informative. You can imagine colored bars across a monitor, some strong and continuous, others broken into tentative pieces. Once the profile entered appropriate investigative databases, the matches reflected people who had consented to forms of law enforcement comparison under the database rules then in effect. Policies differed among services, and investigators had to use those permitted for forensic work. The ethical and legal framework was still developing alongside the science. Every search, therefore, carried procedural questions, as well as genealogical ones. Researchers didn't simply copy private family trees as fact. User-submitted trees can contain mistakes, assumptions, and information taken from other unverified trees. Each relationship had to be supported through original records wherever possible. You watch the genealogist move from an online hint to a certificate, census page, obituary, or marriage license before allowing the line to stand. Sometimes a matches tree ended after only 1 or 2 generations, requiring the researcher to build the rest independently. A maiden name might be missing, an adoption undisclosed, or a family branch obscured by language differences. International research added variations in spelling and record access. The work advanced through evenings filled with quiet searches and the pale light of a monitor. Migration patterns helped explain why some matches appeared distant. Families arriving from Italy might settle near relatives, repeat traditional given names, and maintain connections across several Philadelphia neighborhoods. Those patterns could guide research, but couldn't substitute for documentation. You follow passenger records and naturalization papers, noticing how an ocean crossing becomes one more branch in Joseph's history. On the maternal side, records led through a different set of relatives and locations. The genealogist had to find the ancestral couple shared by multiple matches, then trace every descendant who could plausibly connect to Joseph. This means researching many people, ultimately unrelated to the central question. Most branches are built only so they can be gently ruled out. Ages and geography eliminated some candidates, while direct testing clarified others. A woman living far away at the relevant time might remain biologically possible, yet historically unlikely, unless travel records suggested otherwise. Researchers weighed these circumstances without turning probability into proof. The strongest conclusion arrived only when independent lines began to converge. By the time Joseph's birth certificate was located, the genealogical tree had already pointed investigators toward the correct maternal family. The document didn't appear from nowhere. It answered a carefully framed records request built upon months of research. This is why old cases often move slowly, even after technology provides a lead. The machine offers relatives, while people must still find the right paper. The certificate's discovery also raised the possibility that original detectives might have found Joseph through birth records if they had somehow known which mother to examine. But without a surname, reliable address, or missing report, searching every Philadelphia birth across several years would have produced thousands of children. Most would have no later public record readily available for comparison. You can't fairly measure 1957 investigators by tools that didn't yet exist. They had attempted the broadest public recognition campaign available to them, printing the child's face and sending it into homes throughout the region. They contacted agencies and followed reports from across the country. Their method depended upon someone recognizing Joseph and choosing to come forward. When that didn't happen, the investigation reached a boundary created by the era's systems. The later genealogists crossed that boundary by starting from biology rather than memory. Joseph didn't need to have been reported missing, and no witness needed to recognize his face. Distant relatives could reveal the family, even if they had never heard of him. You can feel the profound change in method. The search moved from asking who remembered the child to asking where his DNA belonged within the human tree. Yet identifying the family still didn't explain why no one reported him missing. That question returned with greater specificity after 2022. Perhaps only a few adults knew where he was living, while others believed he was safely placed elsewhere. Perhaps social pressure encouraged secrecy, or records of concern were never connected to the case. The file offers several possibilities but no publicly established answer. Detectives would examine whether Joseph's parents remained in contact after his birth, and whether either spoke of a child to later family members. Letters, legal proceedings, financial records, and interviews could all help. A payment to an institution or caregiver might leave a trace even when the arrangement itself remained private. You look for recurring amounts in a ledger, though none has been publicly described as decisive. Employment histories could show whether an adult had the means and routine to travel between relevant addresses. Vehicle ownership records, if preserved, might reveal access to transportation, but owning a car or knowing Fox Chase wouldn't establish involvement without additional evidence. Patient investigation builds with several supports, never allowing one circumstantial fact to carry the entire weight. The same applies to family conflict, separation, or later marriages. Such events may provide context for caregiving arrangements, yet they don't prove what happened to Joseph. Online discussions often compress complicated lives into a simple theory, while detectives must preserve uncertainty. You turn away from the noise and return to dates, documents, and corroborated statements. Privacy around surviving siblings limited what police could say publicly, and that boundary left room for rumor. Investigators accepted some public frustration because protecting uninvolved people was more important than satisfying immediate curiosity. An open homicide case also requires discretion about potential witnesses and evidence. The silence around certain details is therefore part of the investigative method. At the press conference, officials emphasized that Joseph's identification was only one step. They invited anyone with information about his life or death to contact the police, hoping the restored name might reach a person untouched by the earlier publicity. A surname can awaken a different memory than a reconstructed face. Somewhere, an elderly listener might recall hearing adults speak of a child named Joseph. Such a person could have been very young in 1957 and still hold only fragments. The sound of the surname, an address near Market Street, or a whispered family disagreement might be all that remained. Detectives would help place the fragment within a timeline without asking it to become more complete than it was. You sit through the silences as the witness searches gently through memory. The interview might occur at a kitchen table rather than a police station, with a clock ticking and afternoon light moving across the floor. Familiar surroundings can help an elderly witness relax, while family photographs provide prompts that don't introduce new facts. An investigator may ask who is standing near a doorway or who took the picture. The work becomes almost domestic in its quietness. Every name mentioned opens another branch of inquiry. Detectives search whether that person was alive, where they lived, and whether their descendants possess papers or stories. One conversation can lead to several households and weeks of records work. You can feel the file expanding again, even after the central name has been restored. Expansion isn't failure if it brings the investigation closer to Joseph's daily world. To understand what happened, police need to know who fed him, who saw him ill, who cut his hair, and who noticed when he was no longer present. Those ordinary acts form the missing structure around the final days. The detective searches for care as much as wrongdoing. This approach keeps Joseph at the center without reducing him to the circumstances of his discovery. He was a child with mornings, meals, familiar rooms, and perhaps small preferences no record preserved. Someone may once have known which toy held his attention or which voice calmed him. The investigation can't recover every detail, but it continues looking for the adults who shared his world. The family genealogy provides names of possible relatives who might have visited, written letters, or discussed Joseph later. Many were already deceased by the time of identification, so investigators sought their children and grandchildren. Family stories sometimes travel indirectly, losing dates, but preserving an unusual event. You listen for a phrase repeated across branches, something several relatives remember hearing in childhood. Independent repetition can be valuable when the witnesses didn't coordinate their accounts. If two descendants recall the same private name or household arrangement from different sources, the detail gains weight. Detectives still search for documents, but oral history may show where to look. The low murmur of family memory becomes another guide through the archive. At the same time, stories can spread through one relative and appear independent when they're not. Investigators ask who first told each person, when the story was heard, and whether it changed after media coverage. Source tracing matters as much in family interviews as it does in genealogy. You draw arrows between speakers, locating the earliest available voice. The police may also compare tips received before and after the announcement. A detail submitted years earlier carries a different evidentiary value if it matches information learned through DNA, but never publicly disclosed. That doesn't prove the caller's entire theory, though it justifies renewed attention. You retrieve the old recording or report and listen again for the overlooked sentence. Audio tapes from earlier decades may have deteriorated, their magnetic surfaces shedding or stretching with age. Preservation specialists can digitize them carefully, reducing the risk of losing the only recording of a deceased witness. The restored audio may contain background hiss, room noise, and voices softened by time. Through headphones, a detective hears an old interview become present again. Typed summaries are useful, but they may omit hesitations, corrections, or exact phrasing. Listening to the original voice can reveal that a witness was uncertain where the report sounded definite. It can also recover a name misspelled by the typist. You hear the real turn, the speaker pause, and an investigator from long ago ask the next measured question. Handwritten notebooks deserve similar review. Officers often recorded brief impressions in the field before preparing formal reports, and the notebooks might contain phone numbers, alternate spellings, or remarks left out of the final version. Locating them after retirement can be difficult, and many departments didn't preserve every notebook. Where one survives, its worn cover becomes a small doorway into the original day. Photographic negatives can also hold more detail than printed copies circulated through the file. Modern scanning may reveal background objects, surface markings, or landscape features obscured in older prints. Enhancement must remain faithful, distinguishing improved visibility from invented detail. You watch the image brighten slowly on a screen, while the analyst guards the boundary between clarification and interpretation. The scene photographs might assist in reconstructing how the carton rested, which direction its opening faced, or whether vegetation had been disturbed. Those observations could inform the likely manner of placement without identifying a person. Investigators combine them with weather reports and witness estimates about when the box first appeared. The result is a careful range, not a cinematic reconstruction. Maps from the period show property boundaries and paths later erased by construction. Aerial photographs can reveal open fields, nearby institutions, and routes less obvious from street level. Detectives may compare driving times from relevant addresses using the road network of 1957 rather than modern highways. You trace those older routes, following narrow lines through a city arranged differently around you. This geographical work can help evaluate whether a witness's account is plausible. If someone described a journey taking a certain length of time, period traffic patterns and road conditions offer context. Still, people choose unexpected routes, stop along the way, and remember duration poorly. Geography narrows possibility without dictating truth. The area's proximity to the foster home drew continued attention, but other residents and institutions also occupied the surrounding landscape. Investigators catalogued who had legitimate reasons to travel Susquehanna Road during the relevant period. Delivery drivers, employees, visitors, and local families all formed part of the background. You see the map, fill with pins, none yet carrying the certainty of an answer. Cold case detectives often describe this stage as rebuilding the victim's circle. They begin with biological family, then move outward through caregivers, neighbors, medical providers, employers, and acquaintances of those adults. Each ring contains people who may know only one small piece. In Joseph's case, time had thinned every ring, making the rebuilding unusually delicate. The restored identity at least gave the circles a center. Before 2022, investigators had no confirmed family from which to move outward. They could only examine theories approaching from the edges. Now, the method could reverse, beginning with Joseph's birth and tracing every documented connection toward February of 1957. You place the 13th of January, 1953, at the start of a new timeline. The first entries would include the hospital and information recorded at birth, followed by any certificate amendments, medical visits, residences, or legal proceedings. Long blank intervals would then appear where no public record had been found. Detectives don't fill those intervals with assumptions. They mark them clearly and search for the next reliable point. A blank interval may conceal ordinary family life, a change of caregiver, or a move never formally documented. It may also reflect records destroyed through routine retention rather than deliberate concealment. This distinction matters because absence can invite stories more quickly than it supports them. You let the blank remain white on the page, an honest representation of what is unknown. But years later, one more class of record could offer context, and it waited not in a police archive, but among the quiet administrative traces of the city's hospitals, courts, and charitable agencies. Detectives began locating custodians, learning which collections had survived, and preparing the authorizations needed to examine them. Another series of letters left the office, their envelopes carrying Joseph's restored name into buildings where it might have appeared once before. The first replies came back in official envelopes, some containing indexes or retention schedules, and others explaining that the requested material no longer existed. In the ZARELLI case, even a negative answer needed to be preserved, because it prevented later investigators from repeating the same search without reason. You can hear the envelopes opening beneath the desk lamp and the gentle rasp of paper against paper. Each response narrowed the archive. Hospital collections presented a patchwork of possibilities. A major institution might have transferred historic ledgers to a university, while a smaller clinic could have closed without leaving any surviving records. Patient files from the early 1950s were rarely preserved in full, especially when they concerned routine care. Investigators had to locate not only a record, but the institution that inherited responsibility for its absence. The search began with names, addresses, and possible variations, then widened to relatives who might have registered Joseph under their own information. A clerk may have written only a parent's surname, a first initial, and the child's age. If Joseph lived with someone outside his biological family, the name used could have been entirely different. You can imagine the detective preparing a page of alternate spellings and possible aliases. Medical ledgers, where they survived, were often arranged chronologically rather than alphabetically. Searching them might require turning through every entry for a broad period, watching for a familiar address or a 4-year-old patient whose details aligned. The pages could be heavy, their ruled columns filled with fountain pen ink that had faded from black to brown. You follow each line slowly, keeping a finger near the date. A matching age alone would mean very little in a city the size of Philadelphia. Investigators would need location, physical history, family connection, or another specific feature before treating an entry as relevant. The discipline lies in refusing to elevate a resemblance simply because the search has been long. You let most names pass without attachment, waiting for several facts to agree. Charitable organizations created different kinds of records, sometimes noting a household's need, a temporary placement, or the delivery of food and clothing. Those files could contain intimate details never intended for broad circulation, and access required sensitivity even after many decades. The purpose was to understand Joseph's care, not expose the struggles of unrelated families. You move through such material with discretion. Religious agencies might have recorded a child under a baptismal name, a household surname, or the name of a sponsor. Their registers were frequently handwritten and preserved locally, far from centralized databases. A parish secretary or archivist could know which basement cabinet held the relevant volume. The room might smell faintly of floor wax, old bindings, and summer rain on stone steps. Court archives offered another possibility if custody, support, adoption, or guardianship had ever been addressed formally. Yet family arrangements often occurred without a court order, especially when relatives believed the change would be temporary. No legal file would then explain where Joseph went. You can feel the investigators searching for official structure around a life that may have unfolded largely through private decisions. Records involving children were also protected for good reason, which meant detectives needed appropriate legal authority and carefully limited requests. An archivist couldn't simply open every sealed file connected with a family surname. The request had to identify a legitimate investigative purpose and remain narrow enough to protect people outside the case. Patience here belonged to law as much as to research. Weeks could pass between a request and an answer, especially when staff members had to retrieve material stored off-site. During that time, detectives continued interviews and reviewed the old evidence again. Waiting wasn't separate from the investigation. It was woven through every part of it. You place a reminder on the calendar and return to another lead. Some responses arrived as photocopies made from fragile originals. The page edges might be dark, the handwriting pale, and a clerk's stamp partly lost within a fold. Detectives enlarged uncertain sections and compared them with samples elsewhere in the file. You can hear the copier settle into silence while several people study one indistinct word. A name that looked promising still required confirmation from the record's custodian. Investigators asked how the index was created, whether pages were missing, and whether later annotations had been added. Archival context prevents a copied page from being misunderstood. The paper may be old, but the questions surrounding it remain present. Employment records could help place Joseph's relatives during weekday hours. Payroll cards, union files, or personnel rosters sometimes survived when household records did not, showing an address or emergency contact from a particular year. These details might explain who was available to provide daily care. You follow the adult schedules carefully, aware that a child's routine often depended on other people's work. An occupation could also connect a person to Fox Chase, or to the roads leading northeast from West Philadelphia. Delivery routes, construction sites, and institutional employment created regular journeys across the city. Still, such a connection would be only contextual unless supported by evidence closer to Joseph. You draw the route lightly on the map and leave it marked as background. Old automobile registrations might establish whether an adult owned a vehicle compatible with a witness description. But those records had their own limits, and a person could borrow a car, ride with someone else, or use public transportation. Vehicle access expands possibility without proving travel. The careful detective records it, then asks what independent evidence places that vehicle near Susquehanna Road. Insurance records sometimes preserve medical or household information, though access and survival vary greatly. A dependent child might appear on a policy, or a claim might identify a clinic and date. Conversely, Joseph may never have been covered under his own name. You can see how each system offers a narrow window, and how often the glass remains clouded. Social workers from the period might once have known families whose arrangements never reached a court. Their case notes, if preserved, could include visits, observations, and referrals. But agency names and boundaries changed across decades. Locating the correct successor organization required its own history. The investigators became students of bureaucracy, following mergers, renamed offices, and transferred boxes. This administrative archaeology could seem distant from detective work, yet it was central to the ZARELLI investigation. A child's forgotten path might survive only because a clerk filed one form correctly, and an archive later chose not to destroy it. The answer could rest in a storage facility under humming fluorescent tubes. You walk the aisles with an archivist, reading labels softened by dust. Whenever a possible record surfaced, detectives compared it against the established genetic and chronological facts. They asked whether the age fit, whether the address connected to a verified relative, and whether later entries showed the same child elsewhere. One isolated mention might belong to another, Joseph. The goal was continuity, a sequence strong enough to carry his identity through time. Continuity is especially difficult for very young children because they leave few records in their own names. They don't sign leases, receive wages, enroll to vote, or appear in city directories. Their administrative existence is reflected through adults. You look for Joseph in the margins of other people's paperwork, where a small dependent might be indicated by a number, an initial, or a note. School records, so valuable in many missing child cases, offered limited help because Joseph died before most children entered first grade. Nursery schools and kindergartens existed, but attendance wasn't universal, and surviving rosters were uncertain. A child cared for at home might never appear. The silence of the school archive was therefore unsurprising, though investigators still checked the possibility. Day nurseries connected with churches, factories, or settlement organizations provided another route. They sometimes served working mothers and kept basic attendance books. If Joseph attended under a different surname, however, recognition would depend on age, address, or family contact. You imagine a page of children's names beside penciled arrival times, one small line carrying unexpected weight. Photographs from such institutions might survive in newsletters or anniversary collections. Rows of children could be pictured without complete captions, leaving faces available for comparison but not immediate identification. Facial resemblance in a low-quality photograph isn't proof, particularly among young children. Investigators would seek the original negative, date, roster, and testimony before calling any image Joseph. Neighborhood newspapers sometimes printed school events, church picnics, and charity appeals that larger archives ignored. Their pages could preserve the names of families absent from city-wide reporting. Researchers searched local collections and library microfilm, moving through columns of bake sales, sports results, and community meetings. The machine's fan whispered steadily while the years passed beneath the lens. Most pages yielded nothing connected to the case, yet the process helped rebuild the social setting. Investigators learned which organizations served the block, which physicians advertised nearby, and which transit lines carried residents toward other neighborhoods. Context suggested where further records might exist. You note the names of a parish, a clinic, and a settlement house on a fresh sheet. Door-to-door work from 1957 also returned to view. Original officers had canvassed areas around the discovery site, recording who was home and what residents remembered. Those reports might contain family names, later connected through genealogy, even if no one recognized the child then. You reopen the canvas book and follow the addresses in numerical order. A resident's statement that seemed unimportant at the time could gain relevance after identification. Perhaps someone mentioned a regular visitor from West Philadelphia, or a car associated with a particular occupation. Detectives would need to verify that the statement was recorded before later theories emerged. The date on the report becomes part of its value. Most canvas notes remained ordinary. Residents saw nothing unusual, heard no disturbance, and couldn't identify the box. Their repetition may feel monotonous, but it establishes the limits of what the neighborhood observed. Absence of observation isn't proof that nothing occurred. You hear the officer's pencil moving from one quiet doorstep to the next. Winter itself shaped what people noticed. Windows stayed closed, residents spent more time indoors, and darkness arrived early. A vehicle stopping briefly on a lightly traveled road might draw no attention, especially if it appeared to belong there. The air would carry sound differently through bare trees, but only if someone was listening. You stand in the imagined cold and understand the privacy of an ordinary roadside moment. Investigators also examined refuse collection and dumping patterns, because discarded boxes and household items appeared in undeveloped areas with some frequency. Learning whether the carton looked unusual before its significance was known could help evaluate witness recollections. Yet informal dumping created visual clutter that made individual objects easier to overlook. The box could be both visible and effectively unseen. Property owners and municipal workers might have traveled the road routinely. Detectives sought records of maintenance, utility work, and deliveries near the relevant dates. A crew log could place additional witnesses in the area or establish when the roadside was last inspected. You imagine a supervisor's notebook, damp once at the corners and later dried into a slight curl. No public account has described such a log, resolving the timeline. Still, each checked record reduced uncertainty by a small amount. Patient investigation often advances through exclusions that never appear in headlines. The detective learns who wasn't there, which truck took another route, and which household had already discarded its bassinet. The bassinet sales inquiry itself produced a list of purchasers remembered or identified at the time, though the surviving public descriptions vary about how complete that list was. Officers visited families and examined bassinets where possible. A household retaining the item could show that its carton had likely been discarded elsewhere, though even that conclusion required care. You can picture a white bassinet beside a warm radiator while questions are asked in a low voice. Many purchasers were new parents whose lives had no connection to Joseph. Being questioned would have been unsettling, especially with the child's image appearing throughout the city. Detectives had to separate routine purchase from meaningful association without casting a shadow over innocent families. Each completed interview closed one narrow door. If a purchaser no longer had the carton, investigators asked how it had been disposed of or whether someone else had taken it. Memories of packaging rarely remain precise after several weeks. A person may remember carrying a bassinet home, but not whether the store delivered it or a relative removed the box. You can feel the limits of ordinary attention working against the inquiry's need for specificity. The store's employees faced the same problem. They handled many transactions beneath bright counters, with customers arriving in winter coats and paying in cash. The purchase hadn't seemed significant when it occurred. Only later did detectives ask them to recover one face from a stream of otherwise ordinary faces. Some accounts suggested the bassinets were received in a small shipment and sold within a relatively narrow period, which made every purchase theoretically traceable. Yet, theoretically traceable isn't the same as documented. The investigation depended on memory, where receipts lacked names. You rest beside that distinction, hearing the register drawer close in a store that no longer exists. After identification, the known family addresses offered a chance to compare geography with the store. Investigators could ask whether relatives shopped in Upper Derby or knew someone who had recently welcomed an infant. But shopping patterns are broad, and boxes travel easily between households. A geographical overlap would need something more substantial before it carried investigative weight. Family births near the relevant period naturally drew attention because a bassinet might have entered a home around then. Yet detectives had to avoid reasoning backward from the box toward any convenient infant. Many Philadelphia families bought bassinets during those months. You keep the field wide until evidence, rather than coincidence, narrows the view. The blanket could likewise have entered a household through donation, inheritance, or second-hand purchase. Textile patterns repeated across regions, and fading altered how colors appeared in photographs. Relatives looking at an image decades later might recognize the style without recognizing the actual item. The investigator records their response, but doesn't call recognition a match. Objects feel personal because they once touched daily life, yet their histories are often less stable than names or DNA. They move during house clearances, lend themselves to neighbors, and remain in cupboards after everyone forgets their origin. In the ZARELLI case, the carton and blanket carried emotional force because they were close to Joseph, but closeness alone couldn't make them speak. The genetic evidence succeeded where the objects hadn't, because biological inheritance follows measurable relationships. Even degraded DNA could point toward families when enough markers were recovered. But genetics answered only the question encoded within it. It could show kinship, not who purchased a bassinet, arranged care, or traveled across Philadelphia in February of 1957. This boundary shaped the renewed homicide inquiry. Investigators possessed high confidence in Joseph's identity, while facing much lower certainty about the events surrounding his death. The file therefore contained one solved mystery, nested inside another still open one. You can feel the difference in the language: identity confirmed, circumstances under investigation. Detectives returned to the people identified through the family trees, asking questions that genealogists hadn't needed to ask. The genealogist wanted births, marriages, and biological relationships, while the homicide investigator wanted routines, conversations, conflicts, and caregiving arrangements. The same family chart now served a different purpose. You turn it sideways and begin drawing connections based on contact rather than descent. A biological aunt may never have met Joseph, while an unrelated neighbor could have cared for him daily. The most important investigative relationship might therefore appear nowhere in the DNA. Detectives sought social connections around both parents, including friends, employers, landlords, and members of religious communities. The family tree became only the trunk of a wider network. Building that network after so many decades required public records and interviews with descendants. A surviving child might remember an adult family friend whose surname was never written down, perhaps only a first name and occupation. Researchers could then compare directories and wedding announcements to identify possible candidates. You hear the witness say a name slowly, testing how it feels after 70 years. Photographs helped prompt these conversations. Investigators could show groups of adults from family gatherings and ask who visited regularly during the early 1950s. The process had to avoid suggesting that anyone pictured was suspected. A photograph is a map of relationships before it is evidence of conduct. Letters and greeting cards could reveal which relatives remained close despite living across the city. Return addresses placed people in particular neighborhoods, while postmarks fixed a date more reliably than memory. A note mentioning a visit might explain an otherwise hidden connection. You hold the envelope beneath the lamp, noticing the faint ridge left by an old stamp. Telephone records from the period were unlikely to survive at the individual call level, especially for local service. But telephone directories could show who maintained a listed number and when service appeared at an address. That information might help establish household continuity. The heavy directory opens with a dry whisper, its columns dense with abbreviated lives. Utility accounts offered similar context, though access and preservation varied. A change in the account holder could indicate a move or household transition near the relevant date. It wouldn't show every resident, but it could guide interviews and property searches. You copy the service date carefully, giving one administrative fact its proper place. Marriage and separation records helped establish when households formed or changed. If adults moved apart near Joseph's final months, investigators would ask where each person lived and who cared for the child. Yet family transitions don't imply wrongdoing. They matter because they reshape routine, transportation, and responsibility. Births of other children also affected household arrangements. A new infant could bring relatives into a home, create a need for additional care, or lead someone to acquire bassinet. These are ordinary family dynamics, not evidence by themselves. You note them because investigation begins with chronology, while judgment waits for corroboration. Death records within the extended family could explain sudden changes in caregiving. An illness or funeral might send a child temporarily to another relative, leaving only a brief mention in correspondence. Researchers looked for such events around Joseph's known years. The sound of archive pages turning becomes almost like a clock, each certificate marking a change. Military service, travel, and hospitalization could also remove an adult from a household. Investigators examined whether potential caregivers were physically present during crucial periods. A person excluded by reliable records no longer needed speculative attention. You feel the relief of one line erased from the working chart, not because the mystery is solved, but because the field is more honest. When records contradicted family memory, detectives didn't immediately reject either one. An address on a form may have been outdated, while a witness could misremember a year. They searched for a third source capable of resolving the difference. Patient investigation prefers convergence over choosing whichever account feels more compelling. The oldest surviving relatives were interviewed first because time continued moving even after Joseph's identification. Detectives understood that every month could close another source of first-hand memory. Still, urgency in scheduling didn't need to become urgency in tone. The interview itself remained slow, with breaks. repeated questions, and space for rest. An elderly witness may tire quickly or become distressed by family history newly made public. Investigators can return another day rather than press for a complete account at once. Memory sometimes improves after the first conversation, when a person has time to search old photographs or speak with siblings. You leave the recorder off for a moment and allow the room to become comfortable. Follow-up interviews help separate long-held memory from details learned during the investigation. A witness may say, on the second visit, that a name came from a newspaper rather than childhood recollection. Such honesty is valuable. The goal isn't a perfectly consistent story, but an accurate understanding of what the person truly knows. Detectives also document what witnesses don't remember. An inability to recall Joseph may be genuine, especially if contact was brief or hidden from younger relatives. It shouldn't be treated as evasiveness without supporting reason. You note the answer exactly and move to another subject without changing the room's temperature. Family interviews can uncover objects as well as stories. A relative may produce a photograph album, address book, legal notice, or box of letters overlooked in an attic. Investigators arrange to scan relevant material, preserving order and noting where each item was found. The soft click of a scanner joins the case's long collection of patient sounds. Original order matters because neighboring items can provide context. A loose photograph beside a dated letter might have been placed there deliberately, while removing everything into separate piles would erase that clue. Archivists photograph the box before rearranging it. You see the faded ribbons, paper clips, and envelopes resting as one family left them. Not every family was willing to participate, and cooperation couldn't always be compelled. Some people feared publicity, distrusted the genetic process, or wished to protect private relatives. Investigators had to respect legal boundaries while explaining why information might matter. A closed door became another fact, but not evidence of guilt. Where a subpoena or court order was appropriate, police needed a clear legal basis rather than general curiosity. Old cases still operate under present rules, and the age of a mystery doesn't dissolve privacy or due process. This legal patience protects the reliability of any eventual result. You hear the careful language of an affidavit, each assertion tied to documented evidence. Prosecutorial consultation may begin long before a suspect can be named. Lawyers review what evidence would be admissible, which witnesses remain available, and whether hearsay exceptions might apply to old statements. They also distinguish investigative confidence from proof sufficient for court. The file moves from a detective's desk to a prosecutor's table beneath another pool of quiet light. A deceased suspect presents special difficulties because the case can't be tested through trial, and public accusation may harm surviving relatives without offering due process. Investigators therefore hesitate to announce names based only on suspicion. The standard for responsible disclosure remains high. You sit with that restraint, even when the unanswered space feels frustrating. If a possible responsible person were still alive, detectives would need corroboration strong enough to justify interview, search, or charge. Age wouldn't remove the requirement for lawful evidence. Memories, documents, physical findings, and genetic results would have to support one another. The long history of the case makes careful procedure more important, not less. DNA from the crime evidence could theoretically assist if an unknown profile belonging to another person survived. But the public record hasn't disclosed a clean perpetrator profile comparable with modern databases. Mixed and contaminated material from old evidence may not permit such a result. You watch the laboratory report close. without asking it to contain information the sample never preserved. Touch DNA is especially vulnerable to misunderstanding in a case with extensive historical handling. A person's cells on an item can show contact, but not always when, why, or under what circumstances. On a household blanket or retail carton, innocent transfer is entirely possible. Context must accompany every genetic match. The genealogical profile used to identify Joseph came from Joseph himself, which made the relationship question direct. Finding another person's DNA on an object would be much more complicated, because investigators would first need to establish that the material was relevant to the event. A laboratory result doesn't label its own meaning. You keep science beside circumstances, never allowing one to drift away from the other. Trace evidence, such as fibers or soil, can also be re-examined with modern instruments. A fiber might connect the blanket to another textile, while pollen or mineral composition could suggest an environment. Yet comparison requires a suspected source that still exists. After nearly 7 decades, houses are renovated, vehicles disappear, and clothing returns quietly to dust. The original collection practices determine what remains available. Officers in 1957 preserved items they considered important, but they couldn't anticipate every future technique. Some microscopic traces may have been lost because no one then knew to collect or protect them. This isn't necessarily carelessness. It is the unavoidable horizon of each era. Modern cold case investigators learn to read old evidence through that historical context. They ask, what procedures were standard, which chemicals were used, and how items were stored. A treatment applied for fingerprint testing might later interfere with DNA recovery. You can smell the faint chemical residue in the imagined evidence room, a reminder that one method can shape another method's future. Chain of custody records become vital when evidence has moved through several facilities. Every transfer, examination, and repackaging should be documented so that investigators know who had access and under what conditions. Gaps don't automatically make an item useless, but they complicate interpretation. You follow signatures down the page as decades pass between lines. Evidence labels themselves may fade or separate, requiring comparison with photographs and inventories. A handwritten number can resemble another after ink bleeds into cardboard. Custodians verify seals, dimensions, and descriptive notes before assigning identity. The quiet task of matching an old package to an old list protects the entire inquiry. The ZARELLI file survived because many people continued treating it as worthy of preservation. Physical evidence was retained, remains were exhumed when new science offered reason, and records were passed to later investigators. Without that continuity, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to examine. You recognize preservation as an active form of hope. It is easy to imagine cold cases as abandoned until a sudden discovery revives them. But Joseph's case was never entirely still. Detectives answered tips, journalists renewed attention, volunteers tended the grave, and forensic specialists watched technology change. The movement was often too slow for the public to see. Beneath the silence, the file continued breathing. Remington Bristow embodied that continuity during the earlier decades. After formal attention waned, he kept pursuing leads and discussing the case with people who might help. His favored theories didn't produce the identification, yet his persistence kept Joseph within professional memory. You can separate the value of devotion from the correctness of every idea. Later members of the Vidocq Society brought different expertise and a collaborative setting. A forensic artist might notice one problem, a medical examiner another, and a retired detective a gap in interviewing. Their discussions didn't guarantee an answer, but they prevented the case from being seen through only one lens. The room's low conversation became a form of collective patience. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children contributed reconstruction and public reach, placing the unidentified boy before a new generation. Its specialists understood that recognition might still occur despite the passage of time. Digital circulation replaced utility bill inserts, but the fundamental request remained the same. Look at this child and ask whether someone knows his name. The public response kept demonstrating how strongly people wished to restore that identity. Visitors left toys and flowers at Ivy Hill Cemetery, often without knowing any more than the memorial stone revealed. Such gestures didn't solve the case, yet they affirmed that anonymity hadn't erased Joseph's human claim upon attention. You can picture a small toy resting against cool granite. When his name was announced, the grave could finally be changed to reflect it. The letters, Joseph Augustus ZARELLI, gave the memorial what generations of investigators had sought. A birth date joined the date associated with his death, turning an anonymous interval into a named life. You stand quietly before the stone as leaves move across the grass. The new inscription didn't answer where Joseph spent his 4 years. It couldn't identify the hands that cared for him kindly, if any did, or the adults who failed him. But it corrected the first and longest absence in the record. A visitor no longer had to address him, only through a descriptive title. For detectives, this restoration brought both satisfaction and renewed responsibility. The public could understandably see identification as the solution, while the homicide unit saw a new set of investigative doors. Joseph's name permitted searches impossible the day before it was known. You return from the cemetery to the office, where the next stack of reports waits beneath white light. Tips following the announcement were sorted by source, specificity, and whether the caller had first-hand knowledge. Investigators gave priority to accounts involving verifiable addresses, family connections, or details not publicly released. General theories were preserved, but couldn't receive equal attention. The triage process kept limited time focused on the most testable information. A tip from someone born after 1957 could still matter if it came from a parent's letter or repeated statement. Detectives asked to see the original document or identify precisely who had told the story. Family law without a traceable source remained difficult to assess. You draw the line backward from the caller toward the person who first knew. Some tips: likely repeated well-known theories already examined across decades. Investigators compared them against the existing index before opening a new inquiry. This prevented the same rumor from consuming resources each time it resurfaced online. A familiar phrase in the report might lead directly to a folder closed years earlier for lack of corroboration. Other tips introduced unfamiliar details and required fresh interviews. A detective might spend an afternoon locating a former resident, then learn that the remembered family lived on a similarly named street in another neighborhood. The lead would be resolved and documented. You hear the pencil draw one calm line through the working entry. This gradual elimination can seem unrewarding from outside, but it protects the investigation's integrity. Every unsupported claim removed from the field leaves more attention for evidence that can be checked. Cold case work is partly an art of subtraction. You watch the crowded board become slightly clearer without becoming empty. The detectives also had to distinguish between Joseph's biological identity and the surname he may have used in daily life. If he lived with another household, neighbors could remember him under a nickname or entirely different family name. Record searches therefore included physical description, age, and associated adults. The restored name was a key, but perhaps not the only key. A childhood nickname might survive in an elderly relative's memory without appearing anywhere on paper. Investigators asked whether either family reused names or knew of a child spoken about indirectly. They listened for diminutives, middle names, and household terms. A softly remembered syllable could guide the search toward an otherwise hidden relationship. Language and pronunciation could also affect how the surname appeared in records. Clerks wrote what they heard, and families sometimes accepted several spellings in informal use. Genealogists were accustomed to searching these variations. You see a list forming down the page, each spelling opening a slightly different archive door. Addresses required similar flexibility because street numbering and municipal boundaries changed. A residence described by a corner, parish, or neighborhood might not match the modern postal form. Investigators consulted historic maps and directories to translate the location accurately. The old city unfolds beneath your hands, its blocks shifting gently back into their earlier names. When an address matched, detectives examined who lived nearby and whether any known caregiver relationship existed. They looked beyond adjacent houses to family members within walking distance, local employers, and institutions serving the block. Children's daily worlds are often smaller than adult records suggest. A few streets can contain nearly every familiar face. The air of West Philadelphia in the early 1950s would have changed through Joseph's brief seasons. Summer heat gathered against brick walls, autumn leaves collected along trolley tracks, and winter radiators clicked behind curtained windows. These sensory details don't solve anything, yet they return the file to human scale. You are looking for a child who inhabited rooms and weather, not merely a name on a chart. Someone washed his clothing, prepared meals, and knew when he slept. Someone may have taken him to a doctor or cut his hair. The investigation seeks these ordinary acts because they identify the people closest to his daily life. You can almost hear water running into a kitchen basin while an unknown radio program plays in the background. If those caregivers weren't his biological parents, detectives needed to learn how the arrangement began. A relative might have offered temporary help, a private intermediary might have placed him, or an agency record might have gone missing. Each possibility involved different witnesses and documents. You keep them parallel rather than allowing one to become prematurely central. Money can leave traces where relationships do not. Regular checks, postal orders, or ledger entries might suggest support payments, though private cash exchanges would disappear completely. Bank records from that period were unlikely to survive in useful detail. The investigators searched what remained without assuming that silence meant no arrangement existed. Legal notices and newspaper classifieds sometimes reveal private adoption offers or requests for domestic help, reflecting practices now viewed differently. Researchers could examine whether any advertisement corresponded to Joseph's age and family circumstances, but a general notice couldn't be linked to him without additional evidence. You read the small type carefully, then return it to the wider context. Mid-century social attitudes toward unmarried parenthood may have encouraged secrecy around Joseph's birth. Families sometimes concealed pregnancies, arranged distant stays, or placed children privately to avoid public shame. Understanding that climate helps explain why records might be incomplete, though it doesn't establish what occurred in this family. You allow historical context to illuminate without accusing. The people making those decisions may have believed they were protecting reputations or securing care for a child. Later events could unfold beyond their knowledge. Investigators therefore asked not only who made an arrangement, But who retained contact, and when information stopped flowing? The chain of responsibility may have changed several times before February of 1957. A single surviving letter could clarify that chain, which is why detectives continued asking families about private papers. Even a sentence saying that Joseph was staying with someone could establish a date and caregiver. Without such a document, oral accounts remained harder to anchor. You wait beside the open box of correspondence, letting every envelope be examined in order. Genealogical discoveries sometimes lead to family Bibles containing handwritten births and deaths. Such entries can preserve children omitted from public family stories, though their dates and authors need verification. Investigators would photograph the relevant page and compare the ink with surrounding entries. The book's binding creaks softly as it opens to a long-kept secret. No publicly disclosed family document has yet provided a continuous account of Joseph's childhood. That absence is why the homicide investigation still depends heavily on interviews and forensic review. The name restored the beginning of his story, but the middle remains sparsely recorded. You see only a few stones across a wide, quiet stream. Detectives may attempt to infer movement from changes in the adult's addresses, but inference must remain clearly labeled. If a parent relocated, Joseph didn't necessarily move with that parent. If a relative lived near Fox Chase, that doesn't prove Joseph visited. The file protects itself through words such as may, perhaps, and unknown. These modest words can feel unsatisfying, yet they preserve truth better than confident speculation. They tell future investigators where evidence ends and interpretation begins. A well-kept cold case file doesn't hide uncertainty beneath polished prose. You can trust it because the boundaries remain visible. As the revived inquiries continued, police retained certain facts from public release. Those private details could concern Joseph's medical history, the condition of evidence, or knowledge believed relevant to the person responsible. Investigators needed them for evaluating new claims. The closed section of the file remained under lock, its silence serving an active purpose. A caller who independently supplied one of those facts would receive careful attention, particularly if the information couldn't be explained by media exposure. Detectives would then test the caller's access, timeline, and source. Even a correct private detail might have passed through another person. You trace the knowledge itself as though it were an object moving from hand to hand. This method resembles genealogy in an unexpected way. Just as DNA researchers trace a shared segment back toward a common ancestor, detectives trace a piece of information back toward its original witness. Both searches move through relationships and require protection against false connections. The patterns differ, but the patience is the same. Investigators also compared public claims with the exact chronology of media releases. A detail appearing online after a documentary couldn't be treated like a statement recorded years before it aired. Dates of publication, interviews, and tips therefore became essential. You arrange clippings and recordings along a timeline, watching information spread outward from the case. The internet complicated this task by allowing theories to circulate rapidly and lose their original source. A speculation posted tentatively could reappear elsewhere as an asserted fact, then return to police through a sincere caller. Detectives searched backward through archived pages when possible. The digital trail felt newer than the paper file, but it could become just as tangled. Protecting living relatives from this speculation required continued restraint. Police reminded the public that Joseph's siblings weren't responsible for events occurring before some of them were born. Genealogists likewise avoided releasing unnecessary personal details. You can feel the investigation drawing a careful curtain around people whose DNA helped, but whose private lives didn't belong to the story. Compassion also extended to deceased relatives who couldn't explain their decisions. Historical records might reveal difficult circumstances without revealing intent. A responsible account leaves room for what the documents cannot show. You turn the page without assigning a motive where none has been proved. The central moral weight belongs to Joseph, but even there the investigation avoids turning him into an emblem without a childhood. His restored name encourages a quieter question. What ordinary moments filled his 4 years? Detectives search for witnesses partly because those memories could return something beyond evidence. A recollection of his voice or manner would restore a small piece of personhood. Perhaps no such memory will be found, yet the search itself matters. It asks surviving families and the city to recognize that Joseph existed before the roadside and the newspaper photographs. The file begins at his birth now, not at his discovery. You move the earliest tab backward 4 years and feel the shape of the case change. That change affected memorial practices as well. Visitors could speak his name, and official records could connect the grave with the certificate. Genealogical databases could place him accurately within family lines while respecting living relatives. The cemetery stone no longer marked an unidentified child, though it still marked an unanswered loss. For investigators, naming Joseph also allowed standard homicide procedures to be applied more precisely. Victimology, the study of a victim's life and relationships, could finally begin in a meaningful way. Detectives examined family structures, living arrangements, health history, and possible points of contact. You sit with the victimology folder as it slowly becomes thicker than the single unknown person page. Victimology isn't an exercise in blaming the person harmed. It helps identify who had access, who noticed changes, and which routines were interrupted. In a child's case, those questions focus almost entirely upon adults. The method asks who held responsibility and who possessed knowledge. The likely circle of access may have been small, especially if Joseph was kept apart from schools and formal institutions. That could explain why the enormous publicity campaign produced no recognition capable of naming him. Fewer outside observers meant fewer people able to notice his absence. You feel the investigation narrowing toward a household that remains just beyond the record. Yet investigators couldn't assume isolation solely from the lack of identification. A person might have recognized Joseph and stayed silent through fear, loyalty, uncertainty, or personal involvement. Another might have believed the resemblance coincidental. Public campaigns depend upon private decisions that police cannot fully see. In 1957, anyone who came forward risked attention in an era when family reputation carried considerable social weight. A relative might fear exposing an unmarried birth or informal placement. A caregiver might worry about unrelated legal trouble. These pressures provide context for silence without explaining whose silence mattered most. Over the decades, those pressures changed, but the witnesses aged and memories weakened. Later publicity may have reached people more willing to speak, yet less able to provide exact dates. The investigation traded one limitation for another as time passed. You watch the calendar pages turn, every year altering what could still be known. This is why the early reports remain so important. They preserve interviews conducted when streets, households, and recent events were still familiar. Modern detectives can compare those statements with Joseph's identity. searching for overlooked connections. A surname in a witness's address book may now mean more than it did under the heading of an unknown child. Computer analysis can assist by finding repeated names across thousands of pages. Investigators scan records, correct transcription errors, and create searchable fields for dates and places. Yet, software can't reliably interpret every handwritten margin or ambiguous family reference. You move between the database and the original paper, letting each correct the other. Relationship mapping tools can display connections among people, addresses, vehicles, and tips. A dense cluster might reveal that several leads unknowingly pointed toward the same household. But visualization doesn't establish causation. The lines on a screen are prompts for investigation, not proof. Investigators verify each connection through source documents. A shared address must fall within the relevant period, and a claimed friendship needs testimony or correspondence. Otherwise, the network becomes an attractive picture built from weak assumptions. You keep the display simple, allowing only confirmed links to remain solid. The process may reveal that an early lead was closed for a reason no longer persuasive under modern standards. Perhaps a witness was dismissed because investigators couldn't verify a name that genetics now confirms belonged to the family. Such a lead deserves reopening. You retrieve the folder carefully, noticing the date when someone last wrote across its cover. Conversely, modern information may firmly eliminate an old theory. DNA can show that a proposed missing child belonged to an entirely different family, or records can establish that a suspected household had no connection to Joseph. Closing those paths respectfully reduces the burden on innocent descendants. The file becomes quieter as unsupported names are removed from attention. The goal isn't to preserve every mystery forever. It is to distinguish what can be answered from what must remain open, and to keep searching where evidence still offers a route. Joseph's identity demonstrated that a question considered nearly impossible could yield to new methods. That knowledge encourages patience, without promising that every remaining question will do the same. Meanwhile, the physical file continued receiving new material. Genetic reports, court orders, interview transcripts, media timelines, and archival responses joined the original photographs and circulars. Different fonts and paperweights marked the generations of work. You lift one section and feel how much heavier the case has become. Digital evidence required its own preservation, with secure copies, access controls, and records of every change. Genealogical data involving living people needed special protection. Investigators stored working trees separately from materials suitable for public release. The modern case room was quieter than the old one, though its cabinets now included encrypted drives. Future detectives would need to understand the decisions made during the 2019 through 2022 identification effort. Detailed notes recorded which databases were used, how matches were evaluated, and why particular relatives were approached. Reproducibility protects the finding if methods or policies later change. You leave enough explanation for someone years from now to follow the same path. The identification itself was reviewed by officials responsible for amending Joseph's death record. Genetic genealogists could recommend a name, but legal identity required documentary and forensic acceptance. This division of responsibility provided another safeguard. The final conclusion belonged to a process, not to one person's intuition. Once the name entered official records, investigators could issue requests that previously lacked a specific subject. Agencies searching Joseph Augustus ZARELLI might find something missed under the unknown child description. The renewed letters therefore traveled outward again, after the press conference. You imagine his full name typed carefully near the top of each page. Some custodians may have recognized immediately that their holdings didn't reach back far enough. Others searched off-site indexes or consulted retired staff familiar with older filing practices. Even when nothing was found, the act of looking extended Joseph's identity into another institutional memory. The search moved building by building across the city. Private archives and historical societies also received inquiries. Collections donated by social workers, physicians, churches, or neighborhood groups sometimes contain material absent from official repositories. Their finding aids may describe only broad subjects, requiring an archivist to know the collection intimately. You speak softly across a reading room desk while afternoon light settles on cotton gloves. A box labeled Family Services might contain annual reports rather than individual files, yet those reports could name facilities and staff active during Joseph's childhood. That information creates new interview paths through descendants or professional archives. Research often advances one administrative generation at a time. The answer may remain distant, but the route becomes clearer. Oral history projects can preserve neighborhood recollections gathered before Joseph was identified. Investigators search transcripts for relevant surnames, addresses, or references to informal childcare. An interview, recorded for architectural history, might unexpectedly mention a family living above a shop. You listen to voices describing trolley lines and corner stores, waiting for one familiar name. Local maps reveal how close households were to churches, clinics, and relatives. Walking distance matters when a family lacked a car, while transit routes matter when work or caregiving crossed neighborhoods. Detectives reconstruct practical movement, not merely straight-line distance. Your finger follows the old elevated line, pauses at a transfer, and continues northeast. Travel from West Philadelphia to Fox Chase would have taken time, whether by public transportation or automobile. Investigators considered who could make that journey and why the destination might be known to them. But they couldn't assume the person responsible began in West Philadelphia because Joseph may have lived elsewhere by then. The map remains a field of questions. A confirmed caregiver address from early 1957 would therefore be especially valuable. It could narrow the social circle, transportation options, and relevant witnesses. Police continued seeking anyone who knew where Joseph lived during his final months. You write that question in the center of the page and leave space around it. The available birth and genealogical records established his biological origins, but custody remained the missing bridge. Without it, investigators couldn't know which adults' routines mattered most. Every archive request and family interview aimed, in one way or another, to construct that bridge. The work returned repeatedly to the same patient need. Who put Joseph to bed? Who saw him at breakfast? And who would have known when he disappeared from daily life? These aren't dramatic questions, but they are the foundation of the homicide inquiry. A household routine can identify the last dependable witnesses. You let the questions rest in the lamplight, plain and human. Some investigators who had spent years with the case reportedly believed they had suspicions about responsibility, yet police declined to present those suspicions publicly. The evidence hadn't reached a standard that justified naming anyone. This protected both the investigation and people connected only by family history. You close the speculative folder and keep the verified timeline open. Behind that restraint, detectives continued comparing every new lead with facts held privately since 1957. They looked for agreement across genealogy, geography, medical history, and witness knowledge, a promising theory needed to explain more than one isolated clue. It had to fit the entire quiet architecture of the case. The next phase would depend less on broad publicity than on precise corroboration. One surviving document, one independently remembered conversation, or one preserved item could shift the balance of evidence. Investigators couldn't know which, if any, would appear. They could only maintain the file, protect the samples, and continue asking careful questions. And so another request was prepared for an archive whose older holdings hadn't yet been fully examined, while a detective scheduled a second conversation with a relative who had remembered something after the first interview. Outside the office, evening gathered over Philadelphia, softening the windows into dark mirrors. On the desk, Joseph's timeline remained open, at the years still missing, and beside it lay a newly sharpened pencil. The pencil rests beside Joseph's name, while the office grows quieter and the city beyond the glass settles into its patient evening rhythm. His identity was finally established, but the investigation into his death remains unsolved and open to this day, with no one charged and no complete public account of his final years. The detectives may hold suspicions, yet suspicion isn't proof, and the ZARELLI case still waits for evidence strong enough to carry those unanswered questions into certainty. You can leave the timeline as it is now, with its honest spaces and its carefully supported dates, because nothing here needs to be forced into a tidier shape. Joseph is no longer known only by the carton in which he was found, or by the description printed on old circulars and sent through Philadelphia homes. His birth name belongs to him again, spoken gently by investigators, relatives, cemetery visitors, and strangers who waited many years for that small act of restoration. Perhaps the remaining answer will come from a preserved record, a family memory, or a method that today's laboratories haven't yet learned to use. Perhaps it will remain beyond reach, held in conversations that ended long ago, and in rooms whose walls have changed beneath fresh coats of paint. Patient investigation accepts both possibilities, while continuing to care for the evidence, the witnesses, and the simple dignity of the person at the center of the file. For now, you can close the cover without closing the care that kept Joseph remembered through 65 years of uncertainty, while the lamp casts one warm circle across the desk. Beyond it, Philadelphia's streets continue beneath the night, from Market Street toward Fox Chase, carrying familiar sounds through neighborhoods that have changed and endured. The case remains open, the answer remains quiet, and Joseph Augustus ZARELLI's name rests where it always belonged, beneath the soft and watchful light